Greetings, children. Today, we're, I'm reading chapter 5 of The Evolution of Dialectical Materialism, a Philosophical and Sociological Analysis by Z.A. Jordan. This chapter is the first chapter in part 2 of the book, which is titled The Foundations and the Revisions of Dialectical Materialism. And the chapter that I'm reading, chapter 5, is titled The Foundations of Engels' Dialectical Materialism. The sections of this chapter include Section 1, Genetic and Absolute Materialism, Section 2, The Criticism of Reductive Materialism and the Doctrine of Emergence, 3. The Doctrine of Dialectics. 4. The Doctrine of the Relativity of Knowledge. So, those are the sections of the chapter. Now, let me get to the chapter. It says it starts on page 151. And how many pages in a PDF do you think constitute the table of contents and all the parts that are in Roman numerals? How much do I have to skip ahead of 151? Let's guess. I'm going to go 167. One page away. Son of a gun. Okay. It's coffee. Coffee. Okay, the foundation of Engels' dialectical materialism. Let's party. Whether Marx and Engels jointly or Engels alone originated dialectical materialism, there can be no doubt that only Engels should be credited with dialectical materialism's codification. This was recognized implicitly by Lenin in Materialism and Imperial Criticism, for Lenin based his account on what he considered to be the Marxian philosophy on the works of Engels, above all, on Anti-Düring and Ludwig Feuerbach. Engels' system of dialectical materialism contains a definition of matter and materialism, a formulation of the dialectical laws, and a theory of the relativity of knowledge. These three main parts of Engels' dialectical materialism will be examined in the indicated order. Section 1. Genetic and Absolute Materialism. Engels approached the problem of defining, quote, materialism, which may have different senses and has actually been understood in many different ways, from two complementary rather than two different viewpoints. In Ludwig Feuerbach, the book, Engels argued that materialism rests upon a definite conception of the relation between nature or matter and spirit or mind. Materialists of various schools regard matter as primary and mind as secondary, and idealists assert the primacy of spirit to nature. According to the idealist, it is the development of mind that explains the development of nature, whereas the materialists derive mind from matter and explain the development of mind by natural causes. To differentiate materialism from idealism, Engels adopted as his vantage point the view put forward by Feuerbach against Hegel, quote, thinking arises out of being, but being does not arise out of thinking, end quote. Footnote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach, pages 335-337, describing the important differences between his own dialectical method and Hegel's. Marx made essentially the same distinction between materialism and idealism. The quotation from Feuerbach comes from some piece by Feuerbach that, at least in 1967, had not been translated into English. Okay. According to Engels, materialism and idealism, thus understood, presupposed different theological conceptions and entailed different epistemological consequences. Thus, to affirm the primacy of spirit to nature is to assert the creation of the world. On the other hand, to regard matter as primary is to conceive matter as eternal. Moreover, the question of the relation of spirit to nature includes that of the relation of thinking to being, or as Engels put it, of, quote, our thoughts about the world, end quote, to, quote, the world itself, end quote. Both idealism and materialism maintain that we are able to, quote, produce a correct reflection of reality, end quote. While idealism regards, quote, real things as images of this or that stage of the absolute concept, end quote. Materialism comprehends, quote, concepts as images of real things, end quote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach. Ontological idealism presupposes theism and entails epistemological idealism, whereas materialism presupposes atheism and entails realism. Footnote. Some Western historians of dialectical materialism maintain that Engels' distinction between materialism and idealism is based on a confusion and a misunderstanding of metaphysical, epistemological, and theoretical problems. For instance, Bochurisky and Vetter. Their opinion is not supported by the relevant text, although it applies to Lenin's interpretation of the passage under discussion. End footnote. Quote, materialism, as defined in Ludwig Feuerbach, can be called, quote, genetic materialism, end quote, for this materialism asserts that mind originates from and is the highest product of matter. The expression, quote, product of matter, end quote, is not intended to suggest that mind is nothing but matter. The concept of mind designates the phenomena of sense perception, thought, and consciousness, and these are regarded as emergent qualities of matter organized in a particular way. Lenin explained that the materialist elimination of the, quote, dualism of spirit and body, end quote, consists in the assertion that spirit is a function of the brain and through the brain of the external world in and along with which it develops, and that it does not exist independently of the body. Lenin's explanations not only denied the autonomy of the mental and of mind generally, but also implied that for Engels matter was involved as a primary factor in the constitution of the universe, but mind was not. Therefore, from Lenin's viewpoint, genetic materialism should be regarded as a metaphysical theory, for genetic materialism, as Lenin understood genetic materialism, does not claim merely that mental phenomena occur only if certain material conditions are found to exist, but maintains that these material conditions are ultimately the entire cause of mental phenomena and that mind is identical with the functioning of the organism, viz. An epiphenomenon. Without this bold step beyond what could be stated from the standpoint of science, a genetic materialist would have no grounds to affirm that mind is not a primary factor in the universe. It should perhaps be mentioned that to abolish the contrast of mind and nature, mental and physical, by a metaphysical pronouncement is not the same as to invalidate this distinction by means of empirical evidence which alone would carry conviction. This is the reason why scientists prefer to reserve judgment until the mind-body problem can be approached empirically instead of being decided metaphysically. Footnote. Engels could have assumed either that the capacity of sensation was a general property of matter, as Diderot suggested, or that mental phenomena are identical with physical phenomena. The so-called identity theory of mind could not be true unless mental and physical phenomena had the same characteristics. Neither psychology nor natural science is able to produce evidence which would provide the required confirmation of the identity hypothesis as an empirical theory. For the discussion of the identity theory in the light of knowledge available today, see W. Kuhler, W. Kuhler's piece, The Mind-Body Problem, in particular. Engels sometimes seems to support the identity theory of mind and sometimes to criticize the identity theory of mind in the strongest terms, declaring himself for Diderot's solution and the theory of emergence. For the latter point of view, see section 2 of this chapter. End footnote. Genetic materialism should be distinguished from absolute materialism, which asserts that only matter exists or is real, that matter is the ultimate constituent of the universe, and that there is nothing else in the world. To be is to be material. It is clear that absolute materialism involves genetic materialism as absolute materialism's special thesis, but one can support genetic materialism without endorsing absolute materialism. Absolute materialism is the concept expounded by Engels and Anti-Düring. Quote, "The real unity of the world consists in its materiality," end quote, Engels wrote. Quote, "And that the real unity of the world consists in the world's materiality is proved not by a few juggled phrases, but by a long and wearisome development of philosophy and natural science," end quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. Engels was confident that the advance of natural science would increasingly demonstrate man's, quote, "oneness with nature," end quote. The greater this advance is, the more, quote, "impossible will become the senseless and unnatural idea of a contrast between mind and matter, man and nature, soul and body," end quote. And in this way, absolute materialism will be finally securely established. The assertion, quote, "to be is to be material," end quote, is a metaphysical statement as much as Descartes' proposition, quote, "the essence of matter is extension," end quote. Both the assertion, "to be is to be material," and "the essence of matter is extension," reach boldly into what is over and beyond all experience, asserting what is the very nature of matter and what is real. Marx believed that we can study the nature of reality, but not reality's ultimate nature. Engels was no longer inclined to make or accept this distinction. I think, to my understanding, what would be the earmark of metaphysics, right, is deductions about the nature of reality that are not based upon observation, right? That would be the role of like physics, right, or like natural science. Metaphysics is about what can be said about reality without looking at a goddamn thing, right? What are we entitled to presuppose about reality in the absolute sense, right? So, for instance, the most, like, in, like, philosophy, to my understanding, like, for instance, the most well-known one is, I think, therefore I am. Like, Descartes had the idea, I'm going to doubt everything, and I'm going to doubt and doubt and doubt. And then he realized that doubting is a form of thought, that even if his reality, even if what was being thought was totally wrong, there was the fact of cognition. There was the fact of doubting. And so I think, therefore I am, whatever the nature of that being is, there is thinking going on. That's not something that he does through that's a deduction. That's a truth claim that he doesn't make by, like, doing a scientific investigation. He does it via reflection or introspection. I feel like that would be an example of, like, metaphysical knowledge, right? And that's the same thing about, like, the existence of God, right? Whether you say God does or does not exist is not a scientific experiment, right? If God is eternal, and there's this eternal place in a world where everything is constantly changing, but there's this, like, eternal other world, it's not something, like, if you're saying that something can't be discovered by natural science, then you're saying that it exists on a different plane of reality. So whether or not, if you believe in God or not, or you don't believe in God, that's not a question that can be settled using microscopes or telescopes or any type of tool for making sensual observations about the world. Yeah. So both of those statements, materialism is a metaphysics. It doesn't get to opt out just because it's saying that there's not two worlds, there's only one world, and the world is all matter, or something to that effect, doesn't mean they're not, they're opting out of metaphysical claims. Anyway, where am I? Engels' absolute materialism appears to have arisen from Marx's naturalism, i.e. his belief in the sole reality of nature. Absolute materialism was to answer the question why it should be possible to extend the method primarily devised for the study of natural bodies to all phenomena, including those which reveal man's distinctively human traits. Engels' answer transformed Marx's naturalistic methodological monism into a metaphysical monism of absolute materialism and replaced the Marxian unified frame of reference for the description and explanation of human action and experience by a metaphysical theory concerned with the innermost characteristics of nature. These transformations accomplished by Engels turned out to be pregnant with far-reaching and fateful consequences, for they helped to establish dialectical materialism as a comprehensive theory of the world allegedly based upon and confirmed by natural science. Give me a second. Sorry. Where the hell was I? These transformations accomplished by Engels turned out to be pregnant with far-reaching and fateful consequences, for they helped to establish dialectical materialism as a comprehensive theory of the world, allegedly based upon and confirmed by natural science. Thus, the concern with the evolution of man in society, which had been Marx's chief theoretical interest, has been pushed into the background, and the human, moral, and sociological aspect of Marxian philosophy has been subordinated to an abstruse metaphysics appearing in public under the guise of positive science. While Engels' role in the further fortunes of the Marxian philosophy cannot be denied, Engels should not be blamed entirely for what happened many years after his death. Engels did go beyond Marx, who was a naturalist thinker and could never be described as a materialist in Engels' sense. But underlying Marx's naturalism was the belief that only material objects are real. Where Engels stated explicitly what was implicit in Marx, it was not a question of his misunderstanding of Marx. Footnote. The Russian Marxians were particularly vocal in emphasizing the strong differences between Marx and Engels, and set Engels' crude and naive, quote, dogmatic materialism, end quote, against the materialism of Marx. End footnote. Engels erred, end footnote. Engels erred when Engels failed to recognize the invalidity of all metaphysics, both materialistic and idealistic, as opposed to empiricism, and when, with inadequate intellectual resources, as Engels himself admitted, Engels indulged in system-building activities. Engels did not postulate the existence of a corporeal substance, a primitive uniform matter, out of which the world of natural things is made. In this respect, Engels differed from Leucippus and Democritus, and from Descartes or Hobbes in modern times. According to Aristotle, Leucippus and Democritus believed that atoms were like many distinct pieces of gold. Atoms were distinguished from other atoms by those atoms' shape, but, quote, those atoms' nature was one, end quote. Descartes expressed himself with even greater clarity, quote, there is but one and the same matter in the whole universe, end quote. Descartes. Descartes expressed himself, That's from the Descartes' Principles of Philosophy. Although Engels supported a monist solution of the metaphysical problem and saw the unity of the world in the world's materiality, Engels did not thereby declare the existence of a unique material substance. To say that the universe is a unity is to assume that the universe has a nature as a whole. While materialist thinkers of the past identified the nature of the universe as a whole with the material substance underlying all phenomena, Engels seems to have departed from this tradition. To consider matter as the sole reality does not necessarily mean that the irreducible diversity of physical objects should be denied. Qualitative differentiation of physical objects is not incompatible with their having the property of corporeality in common. Engels argued that the resolution of the diversity of physical things and the processes into differentiated forms of matter and motion, transformed into one another in accordance with definite laws, did not presuppose the homogeneity of matter and consequently did not imply that matter should be conceived as the stratum of all observable changes in the world. He suggested that this diversity, quote, was abolished from science by the proof of their interconnections and transitions, end quote, and not by their reduction to a common material substance. Engels suggested that this diversity, quote, was abolished from science by the proof of their interconnections and transitions, end quote, and not by the reduction to a common material substance. Engels also suggested that the natural unity of the world, established by the evidence of, quote, the interconnections and transitions, end quote, from one form of matter into another, opens the prospect of bridging the gulf between organic and inorganic nature, a gulf that otherwise remains impassable. There are good reasons for abandoning the Aristotelian, Thomist, and Cartesian way of thinking, and its assumption that change presupposes an unchangeable substance. If in the search for this single kind of stuff, the Aristotelian materia prima is not reached, the task of constructing the material substance by a process of abstraction appears to remain incomplete. Wikipedia says, prima materia, in alchemy and philosophy, prima materia, materia prima, or first matter, for a philosophical exposition referred to prime matter, is the ubiquitous starting material required for the alchemical magnum opus, and the creation of the philosopher's stone. It is the primitive formless base of all matter similar to chaos, the quintessence of Aether, A-E-T-H-E-R. Esoteric alchemists describe the prima materia using simile and compare it to concepts like the anima mundi. The link that it sends me to for the philosophical thing is like a section of a Wikipedia page, and it's like kind of long. So I'm not going to read it, but I think we have enough of an idea. If in the search for this single kind of stuff, the Aristotelian materia prima is not reached, the task of constructing the material substance by a process of abstraction appears to remain incomplete. But to press the search to its logical conclusion is to cross the point of no return, for the reductive step cannot be reversed. Matter, which is an absolutely constitutive ontological factor, ceases to function as a principle of individuation. We are unable to deduce the world of nature with its richness of directly observable qualities from an indeterminate primordial matter and mechanical motion. The failure to discover the passage from the original uniform matter to the world of nature as known in experience, or to fill the wide gap separating observable qualities from shape and motion, has been regarded as a serious defect of mechanistic theories, or even as conclusive evidence that cosmology cannot be built upon a materialistic foundation. Footnote. See Pierre Duhem, The Aim and Structure of Physical Theory, and R.G. Collingwood, The Idea of Nature. The weakness of the, quote, theory of the absolute... Where am I? Where the hell am I? End footnote. The weakness of the, quote, theory of the absolute qualitative identity of matter, end quote, was clearly seen not only by the adversaries of materialism, but by Engels as well. Moreover, the assumption that, quote, all matter consists of identical smallest particles, end quote, is the basis of the Cartesian Newtonian mechanistic conception of nature, in which everything is in a state of continuous change, but nothing new emerges, for all change is really cyclical and produces the same results over and over again. In general, the category of substance appears to lead to the interpretation of nature in terms of the stability, constancy, and permanence of things. The physiologist or psychologist, wrote Mach, about the same time, 1885, can make nothing of the notion of a, quote, rigid matter, end quote, of which the only changes are changes of place. Footnote. See Ernst Mach, The Analysis of Sensations. Engels rejected the concept of primordial matter because it undermined the reality and reduced the significance of growth, evolutionary development, and the emergence of novelty. Ultimate reality is, by definition, fixed and immutable, for if it were not, it could not be ultimate. Thus, change is spurious, for it does not affect the, quote, identical smallest particles, end quote, or the material substance, and there is no coming into being and passing away in the Aristotelian sense, for there is no substantial change. The category of material substance reflects, as Engels put it, quote, the anti-dialectical manner of philosophizing, end quote, the unhistorical view of nature, end quote. It suggests a static universe in which change is subordinated to substance and novelty to constancy. Thus, Engels was led to a conception of nature first suggested by Helvetius and Holbach, in which matter is not regarded as a material substance, un et unique. What the hell does that mean?
Un être unique. Un être unique.
Un être unique, which translates as unique being, but as an un genre d'être, un genre d'être, I don't know if I'm saying that right, let's see. Un genre d'être.
Un genre d'être. Un genre d'être.
Un genre d'être. So, which translates as a kind of being. The summum genus of the classification of bodies, quote, the summum genus of the classification of bodies on the basis of their physical and chemical properties, end quote. The hell does summum genus mean?
Summum genus.
Sorry. Top fucking, I don't know. Summum genus means the highest class, it looks like. It's a Latin word. So let me repeat that whole sentence again. Thus Engels was led to a conception of matter first suggested by Helvetius and Holbach, in which matter is not regarded as a material substance un et unique, but as an engendet. Quote, the summum genus, or the highest class, of the classification of bodies on the basis of their physical and chemical properties, end quote. Footnote. J.B. Stalo, The Concepts and Theories of Modern Physics. Stalo, who lived from 1823 to 1900, was Engels' contemporary, and his book first appeared in 1881. Also is cited is Holbach, Système de la Nature, Tome 1. Okay, so end footnote. Back to the text. Matter, wrote Helvetius, is not a substance but a concept, and in this sense a creation of man. Quote, matter is not a being, for in nature there are only individuals to which the same body has been given. ... The word, quote, matter, end quote, can only be understood to connote the collection of properties common to all these bodies, end quote. Helvetius. De l'Esprit. Discours 1, Chapter 4. I don't know. End footnote. Engels followed in the footsteps of Helvetius and Holbach and conceived matter as a theoretical construct whose relation to reality had to be explained and established, as we would say today, by means of semantical definitions or operational rules of meaning. These rules or definitions would have to state the necessary and preferably the sufficient conditions, such as extension, impenetrability, solidity, and so forth, which an object would have to satisfy to be a material object, a body in Helvetius' sense of the term. Therefore, for Engels, the term, quote, matter, end quote, signified a meta-theoretical concept rather than a concrete entity, and was part of the meta-language of science rather than of science's object language. Quote, matter as such is a pure creation of thought and an abstraction. We leave out of account the qualitative differences of things in lumping things together as corporeally existing things under the concept of matter. Hence matter as such, as distinct from definite existing pieces of matter, is not anything sensuously existing. When natural science directs natural science's efforts to seeking out uniform matter as such, to reducing qualitative differences to merely quantitative differences in combining identical smallest particles, it is doing the same thing as demanding to see fruit as such instead of cherries, pears, apples, or mammals as such, instead of cats, dogs, sheep, etc., gas as such, metal, stone, chemical compound as such, motion as such. End quote. Engels, Dialectics of Nature. Footnote. Plekhanov observed in a similar vein that to believe in the existence of a secret essence of things is harmful for the advancement of knowledge, for the belief in the existence of a secret essence of things hinders the study of the, quote, real movement of things, end quote. By accepting the belief in essence, quote, we incur the danger of denying real facts for the sake of a theory which may appear to us more or less clever, but in any case is absolutely arbitrary, end quote. Plekhanov. This is a refreshingly original observation on the part of a Marxian essentialist, and one striking in its modernity. See Karl Popper's Conjectures and Refutations. End footnote. Engels' argument against, quote, matter as such, end quote, follows in the footsteps of Berkeley's criticism of material substance, and oddly enough, the physical tradition of phenomenalism which he originated. according to Wikipedia. Wait, let's see if the Stanford... no. Stanford, you're fucking up. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is usually pretty helpful. In metaphysics, phenomenalism is the view that physical objects cannot justifiably be said to exist in themselves, but only as perceptual phenomena or sensory stimuli, e.g. redness, hardness, softness, sweetness, etc., situated in time and in space. In particular, some forms of phenomenalism reduce all talk about physical objects and the external world to talk about bundles of sense data. Back to the text. Engels' argument against, quote, matter as such follows in the footsteps of Berkeley's criticism of material substance, and oddly enough, the philosophical tradition of phenomenalism which Berkeley originated. Berkeley argued that if no sensible qualities can be attributed to matter, matter becomes, quote, something in general, end quote, and has, quote, no more claim to existence than a golden mountain or a centaur, end quote. Locke's, quote, unknowable somewhat, end quote, that underlies all known corporeal qualities is a mere play with words employed to, quote, no manner of purpose, without any design or signification whatsoever, end quote. Footnote. 3 dialogues between Hylas and Philinus, the works of George Berkeley. I tried to look up this unknowable somewhat question, but it says it doesn't seem like nothing directly came up for that, but unknowability came up from Wikipedia and philosophy, so I'll read that. In philosophy, unknowability is the possibility of inherently inaccessible knowledge. It addresses the epistemology of that which we cannot know. Some related concepts include the halting problem, the limits of knowledge, the unknown knowns, and chaos theory. Nicholas Rescher provides the most recent focused scholarship for this area in Unknowability, an inquiry into the limits of knowledge, where Rescher offered 3 high-level categories: logical unknowability, conceptual unknowability, and in-principle unknowability. Back to the text. In a similar manner, Engels jokingly argued that first we make sensuous things into abstractions, and then we want to know things through the senses to see time and smell space. Quote, matter as such and motion as such have not yet been seen or otherwise experienced by anyone, ... Because matter as such and motion as such are creations of thought and not sensuous objects, end quote. Engels, Dialectics of Nature. Engels was unaware of Bishop Berkeley's view on the subject, though he explicitly referred to Hegel, who had rejected the concept of indeterminate universal matter as an instance of, quote, bad metaphysics, end quote. That is, of what Engels called the, quote, metaphysical mode of thought, end quote. What's I looking for? Where am I? Okay. Back to the text. Engels believed that the proposition, quote, only matter exists, end quote, is meaningful and true if and only if the term, quote, matter, end quote, is taken in its distributive sense. If it refers to matter under some particular form, and denotes the class of material or physical objects, the, quote, totality of bodies, end quote, as Engels explained, of, quote, all material existences extending from stars to atoms, end quote. Engels' Dialectics of Nature. Quote, matter is nothing but the totality of material things from which this concept matter is abstracted, and motion is such, nothing but the totality of all sensuously perceptible forms of motion. Words like, quote, matter and, quote, motion are nothing but abbreviations in which we comprehend many different sensuously perceptible things according to their common properties, end quote. Engels' Dialectics of Nature. Engels rejected the Aristotelian framework of substance and property in terms of which the objects of sense experience were to be described. In this respect, Engels showed a striking understanding for the tendencies inherent in modern physical theories. Modern physical theories increasingly depart from the Aristotelian ontological frame of reference, for it is not applicable to the objects investigated by physics. One of the necessary conditions of an object being material is that that object exists independently of being perceived. Absolute materialism implies realism. Footnote. Some physicists of today reject materialism because physicists believe that some subatomic phenomena are incompatible with a realistic theory of knowledge. See P.H. Frank, Foundations of Physics, pages 54 to 55, and the critical analysis of this point of view in E. McMullen, Introduction, the Concept of Matter. End footnote. But the belief in independent physical objects is not equivalent to the belief in the sole reality of matter. To be a material object is to exist in time and space, to be impenetrable and heavy, uncreatable, and indestructible. Footnote. Quote, there is nothing in the world but matter in motion, and matter in motion cannot move otherwise than in space and time, end quote. Lenin. Neither Engels nor Lenin had anything to say on the subject of space and time, and both were satisfied to repeat Feuerbach's views almost word for word. Where Engels and Lenin tried to say something on their own, Engels and Lenin talked plain nonsense. For instance, Lenin tried to show that Mach's arguments against absolute time and space amounted to, quote, deserting natural science for fideism, end quote. Footnote. The principle of the uncreatability and indestructibility of matter is better known in its Latin formulation, de nihilo nihil in nihilum nil posse reverti. See Kant, Critique of Pure Reason. This a priori principle, expressed in empirical terms, is known today as the principle of the conservation of matter. The principle of the conservation of matter. End footnote. Above all, to be a material object is to be in motion. A motionless state of matter is an absurdity. Quote, never anywhere has there been matter without motion, nor can there be, ... Matter without motion is just as inconceivable as motion without matter, end quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. The term, quote, motion, end quote, is used by Engels and also by Marx in the broad Aristotelian, not in the narrow modern sense. The term, quote, motion does not mean, quote, change of place, end quote, alone, but, quote, all changes and processes occurring in the universe from mere change of place right up to thinking, end quote. Engels, Dialectics of Nature. While in classical physics the concept of motion implies matter, movement entails something that moves, and kinetic energy presupposes the mass, E equals mv squared divided by 2. Matter does not imply motion. A motionless body is neither logically nor physically impossible. Engels could claim that matter and motion were in fact inseparable, but Engels clearly overreached himself by asserting that it could not be otherwise. Engels could claim that matter and emotion were in fact inseparable, but Engels clearly overreached himself by asserting that it could not be otherwise. And what would be otherwise? That matter and motion were separable. An empirical truth is not a truth of logic. Confusing an empirical truth and a truth of logic is not made respectable by providing an argument against natural theology. Footnote. Some contemporary dialectical materialists recognize this fact. See Eilstein. What's that? What fact is that? The Engels could claim that matter and motion were in fact inseparable, but Engels overreached himself by asserting that it could not be otherwise, that matter and motion were separable. So end footnote. According to Wikipedia, natural theology, once also termed physico-theology, is a type of theology that seeks to provide arguments for theological topics such as the existence of a deity based on reason and the discoveries of science, the project of arguing for the existence of God on the basis of observed natural facts and through natural phenomena viewed as divine, or complexities of nature seen as evidence of a divine plane. See predestination or will of God, which includes nature itself. This distinguishes it from revealed theology, which is based on scripture and/or religious experiences, also from transcendental theology, which is based on a priori reasoning. It is thus a type of philosophy with the aim of explaining the nature of the celestial motors or gods, or of one supreme God that are responsible for heavenly motion. Aristotle's Tractate on Metaphysics claims to demonstrate the necessary existence of an unmoved prime mover. For monotheistic religions, this principally involves arguments about the attributes or non-attributes of a deity, and especially the deity's existence, using arguments that do not involve recourse to revelation. The ideals of natural theology can be traced back to the Old Testament and Greek philosophy. Early sources evident of these ideals come from Jeremiah and the Wisdom of Solomon, and Plato's dialogue Timaeus. Marcus Terentius Varro, who lived from 116 to 127 BCE, established a distinction between political theology, the social functions of religion, natural theology, and mythical theology. His terminology became part of the Stoic tradition, and then Christianity through Augustine of Hippo and Thomas Aquinas. So that's natural theology. Back to the text. The last sentence I read says, confusing an empirical truth with a truth of logic is not made respectable by providing an argument against natural theology. Motion is the mode of existence of matter. Motion accounts for matter's individuation and the infinity of matter's forms. It is motion that breaks the continuity of matter, differentiates matter into individual bodies, determines individual bodies' properties, and establishes individual bodies' irreducible qualitative diversity. The motion of matter includes the, quote, possibility under favorable conditions of being transformed into heat, electricity, chemical action, life, end quote. To the list of which, in another context, Engels added consciousness. The capacity of producing these various forms out of itself is an inherent characteristic of moving matter. Consequently, in the eternal cosmic cycle of one universe developing from another, a cosmogonic doctrine highly favorable in the 19th century and supported by Engels, matter always reproduces the conditions favoring the appearance of organic life and of man, quote, even if only after millions and millions of years, and more or less by chance, but with the necessity that is also inherent in chance, end quote. Engels, Dialectics of Nature. Engels combined the hypothesis of emergent evolution, about which more will be said later, with a cosmogonic doctrine of eternal return, to show that materialism offers an alternative to creationism. Wikipedia says, emergent evolution is the hypothesis that in the course of evolution some entirely new properties, such as mind and consciousness, appear at certain critical points, usually because of the unpredictable rearrangement of the already existing entities. The term was originated by the psychologist C. Lloyd Morgan in 1922 in his Gifford Lectures at St. Andrews, which would later be published as the 1923 book Emergent Evolution. The hypothesis has been widely criticized for providing no mechanism to how entirely new properties emerge for its historical roots in teleology. Historically, emergent evolution has been described as an alternative to materialism and vitalism. Interest in emergent evolution was revived by biologist Robert G.B. Reed in 1985. Emergent evolution is distinct from the hypothesis of emergent evolutionary potential, EEP, which was introduced in 2019 by Jean Levinson. In emergent evolutionary potential, the scientific mechanism of Darwinian natural selection tends to preserve new, more complex entities that arise from interactions between previously existing entities when those interactions prove useful by trial and error in the struggle for existence. Biological organization arising via EEP, emergent evolutionary potential, is complementary to organization arising via gradual accumulation of incremental variation. And Wikipedia says, in reference to eternal return or eternal recurrence is a philosophical concept which states that time repeats itself in an infinite loop and that exactly the same events will continue to occur in exactly the same way over and over again for eternity. In ancient Greece, the concept of eternal return was most prominently associated with Stoicism, the school of philosophy founded by Zeno of Citium. The Stoics believed that the universe is periodically destroyed and reborn, and that each universe is exactly the same as the universe before. This doctrine was fiercely criticized by Christian authors such as Augustine, who saw in it a fundamental denial of free will and the possibility of salvation. The global spread of Christianity therefore brought an end to classical theories of eternal return. The concept was revived in the 19th century by German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Having briefly presented the idea as a thought experiment in the gay science, he explored the concept of eternal return more thoroughly in his novel Thus Spoke Zarathustra, in which the protagonist learns to overcome his horror of the thought of eternal return. It is not known whether Nietzsche believed in the literal truth of eternal return, or if he did not, what he intended to demonstrate by it. Nietzsche's ideas were subsequently taken up and reinterpreted by other writers such as Russian esotericist P.D. Uspensky, who argued that it was possible to break the cycle of return. Okay, so let me reread that sentence because I looked up a bunch of things. Engels combined the hypothesis of emergent evolution, about which more will be said later, with a cosmogonic doctrine of eternal return. Cosmogonic, should look that up too. it doesn't have a Wikipedia page, but dictionary speaking, it says, the meaning of cosmogony is a theory of the origin of the universe. Back to the text. Engels combined the hypothesis of emergent evolution, about which more will be said later, with a cosmogonic doctrine of eternal return to show that materialism offers an alternative to creationism. Engels did not adhere consistently to the distributive conception of matter. But the fact that he was a qualified reist prevented him from falling into the error of which Lenin fell victim, namely a purely epistemological definition of matter. The fuck is reism? According to Wikipedia, reism says, sorry, not Wikipedia, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy says, reism is the doctrine that only things exist. The name reism is derived from the Latin noun res, quote, thing, end quote. The interpretation of this very rough view depends on how things are understood. Reism was anticipated by many nominalists, that is, philosophers maintaining that only individuals exist, and materialists, particularly by the Stoics. Medieval doctrines of singularia, particulars, are Hobbes's considerations on corpora, bodies. Some tenets of reism are to be found in Leibniz. Brentano defended reism very strongly in his later philosophy, when Brentano argued against entia rationis, objects of thought. Brentano meant by this objects which exist in thought alone. Brentano became a reist in about 1904 and attracted to this position some of his younger followers, so-called younger Brentanists, like O. Krauss, A. Castile, and G. Katkov. The most developed version of reism can be credited to Tadeusz Kotorbinski, I don't know if I'm saying that right, 1886 to 1981, a Polish philosopher and one of the leading members of the Lvov-Warsaw School. He introduced the term, quote, reism, end quote, to denote the philosophical view that the category of things is the sole ontological category. In other words, reism reduces all categories to that of things, yet reists differ in their views about what exactly is included in the category of things. For example, if one takes the Aristotelian table of categories, 10 rubrics, substance, relation, etc., the reist would say that substances interpreted as things are the only existence. Reism also has a semantic dimension, for reism recommends that only singular names, that is, names referring to concrete things, should be used, and abstract words avoided. Eventually, one can use sentences with abstract words, provided that they have translations into statements with singular terms. So that's reism. Man, we're learning a lot today, aren't we, kids? So let me reread that sentence. But the fact that Engels was a qualified reist prevented Engels from falling into the error of which Lenin fell victim, namely a purely epistemological definition of matter. Although in Materialism and Imperial Criticism, Lenin went out of his way to emphasize that his epistemological and philosophical concept of matter did not deviate from the tradition established by Engels, their respective use of the term, quote, matter and, quote, materialism is entirely different. Engels had a metaphysical concept of matter, which was distinct from Lenin's epistemological concept and more general. Engels was a realist in the theory of knowledge, which, in his opinion, was an obvious position to adopt once Hegel's perversion of the true relation of consciousness to being was exposed. While Plekhanov, in his comments on Ludwig Feuerbach of 1892, felt that the arguments against epistemological realism, produced from the viewpoint of Berkeley, Hume, and Kant, should not simply be dismissed with a shrug of the shoulders. Engels saw no need of refuting the, quote, agonists on the question of the objective reality of the external world. According to Wikipedia, epistemological realism is a philosophical position, a subcategory of objectivism, holding that what can be known about an object exists independently of one's mind. It is opposed to epistemological idealism. Epistemological realism is related directly to the correspondence theory of truth, which claims that the world exists independently and innately to our perceptions of it. Our sensory data then reflect or correspond to the innate world. So that's epistemological realism. Did I say agonist before? I meant to say agnostics. Shit. Well, anyway, I got to reread it anyway. While Plekhanov, in Plekhanov's comments on Ludwig Feuerbach in 1892, felt that the arguments against epistemological realism, produced from the viewpoint of Berkeley, Hume, and Kant, should not simply be dismissed with a shrug of the shoulders, Engels saw no need of refuting the, quote, agnostics, end quote, on the question of the objective reality of the external world. In Engels' view, the untenability of the agnostic position, the, quote, agnostic position, end quote, in the theory of knowledge did not admit even the shadow of doubt. Although materialism involves realism, materialism's conception of the relation of mind to matter, genetic materialism, and its belief in the sole reality of matter, absolute materialism, is what makes it a distinctive theory of the world. One second. It is the belief in the materiality of the objects of the external world and not in their independent existence, which distinguishes materialism as a metaphysical doctrine. Genetic and absolute materialism constitute what Engels called, quote, materialism as a general world outlook, end quote, as distinguished from other outlooks and from its own special form, that is, from a materialist doctrine formulated as at a definite historical stage and dependent in its content on a given state of knowledge. Engels pointed out that with each, quote, epoch-making discovery, end quote, this special form of the materialist world outlook was bound to be changed, and Lenin emphasized that a revision of this kind did not constitute revisionism, i.e. the abandonment of Engels' materialism, but was, quote, demanded by Marxism, end quote. The proposition attributing materiality to all real objects is a permanent component part of the materialist theory of the world. But the description of what this materiality consists in, being dependent on the knowledge available at a given time, constitutes a special form of the materialist world outlook. In the past, and also in our present everyday language, the concept of matter was related by an appropriate semantical definition to something extended, heavy, and impenetrable. For the 20th century physicist, matter consists of electrons, protons, positrons, and so forth. The operational rules of meaning of the past do not apply universally any longer to matter in the sense of the 20th century. We would not get very far if we tried to find out whether a subatomic particle is material in that sense and carried out the appropriate testing operations. The operational rules of meaning which govern the use of the term, quote, matter, end quote, change with time. On the other hand, we cannot liberate, quote, matter, end quote, as it were, from all operational rules and fix its meaning once and for all if we wish to retain matter as an empirically meaningful theoretical term. Footnote: the dependence of the meaning attached to the term, quote, matter, end quote, on the operational rules does not imply that the only legitimate problem is to agree about an unambiguous use of the term, quote, material object, end quote. This seems to be the view of P.H. Frank in Foundations of Physics. The linguistic problem is an important but not an autonomous issue, for its solution depends upon our knowledge of what matter is. End footnote. Hey kids, section 2. Alright. The section 2 is titled The Criticism of Reductive Materialism and the Doctrine of Emergence. Wikipedia will tell you. Maybe I should see if there's is there a Stanford... I don't really see it. Don't think I see one. Time is of the essence. I have nowhere to be. I don't know why I'm saying that. According to Wikipedia, emergence. In philosophy, systems theory, science, and art, emergence occurs when a complex entity has properties or behaviors that its parts do not have on their own and emerge only when they interact in a wider whole. Emergence plays a central role in theories of integrative levels and of complex systems. For instance, the phenomenon of life, as studied in biology, is an emergent property of chemistry and physics. In philosophy, theories that emphasize emergent properties have been called emergentism. Yeah. I'm not going to look that up. Back to the text. Engels' absolute materialism is as anti-reductivist as Comte's positivism. If you're curious about Comte, be sure to listen to the last chapter of this book that I put up, which is about the relationship between dialectical materialism, or Marxism in general, and Comte's positivism. French positivism as represented by Comte and Saint-Simon. But that's the last video. Footnote: the impact of Comte's vigorous criticism of reductivism upon Engels cannot be substantiated, but is plausible. As far as Comte's anti-reductivism is concerned, see chapter 4 of this study. So yeah, the last chapter. End footnote. While the term, quote, reductivism cannot be found in Engels, the concept of reductivism can, referred to by such expressions as, quote, mechanistic or, quote, vulgar materialism. According to Wikipedia, reductionism, which is different than reductivism, I guess, in terms of what it's sped, but reductionism is any of several related philosophical ideas regarding the associations between phenomena which can be described in terms of other, simpler, or more fundamental phenomena. It is also described as an intellectual and philosophical position that interprets a complex system as the sum of its parts. Back to the text. Engels did not wish to have anything to do with mechanistic or vulgar materialism. The former belonged to long mechanistic materialism, belonged to long past times when chemistry was in an infantile stage and biology lay in swaddling clothes. Vulgar materialism, a, quote, shallow popularization of materialism, end quote, was a survival of the past and was capable of flourishing in Germany in the 1850s because it made up for the lack of science in Germany. These two schools of materialism were clearly attempts to establish a world outlook with data inadequate for this task. They were disowned both by philosophers and men of science. It was the mechanistic conception of nature which at that time was the stronghold of reductivism. The mechanistic conception tried to establish a comprehensive theory which would unify all domains of natural science, physics, chemistry, and biology in particular, in terms of a set of common basic concepts and principles, and at the same time provide a secure basis for the further advancement of knowledge, including the progressive integration of other sciences and the elaboration of more specific theories. Furthermore, the mechanistic conception of nature was regarded as final. Quote, as long as humanity attempts to develop science, mechanism will continue to be developed with it, end quote. Only the explanation of phenomena is in terms of motion is, quote, really eternal, end quote. C. A. Meyerson, Identity and Reality. At the time under discussion, classical mechanics was considered the fundamental science of nature. According to Wikipedia, classical mechanics is a physical theory describing the motion of objects such as projectiles, parts of machinery, spacecraft, planets, stars, and galaxies. The development of classical mechanics involves substantial change in the methods and philosophy of physics. The qualifier classical distinguishes this type of mechanics from physics developed after the revolutions in physics of the early 20th century, all of which revealed limitations in classical mechanics. The earliest formulation of classical mechanics is often referred to as Newtonian mechanics. It consists of the physical concepts based on the 17th century foundational works of Sir Isaac Newton and the mathematical methods invented by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, Leonhard Euler, and others to describe the motion of bodies under the influence of forces. Later, methods based on energy were developed by Euler, Joseph Louis Lagrange, William Rowan Hamilton, and others, leading to the development of analytical mechanics, which includes Lagrangian mechanics and Hamiltonian mechanics. These advances had made predominantly in the 18th and 19th centuries, extended beyond earlier works. They are, with some modification, used in all areas of modern physics. If the present state of an object that obeys the laws of classical mechanics is known, it is possible to determine how it will move in the future, and how it was moved in the past. Chaos theory shows that long-term predictions of classical mechanics are not reliable. Classical mechanics provides accurate results when studying objects that are not extremely massive and have speeds not approaching the speed of light. With objects about the size of an atom's diameter, it becomes necessary to use quantum mechanics. To describe velocities approaching the speed of light, special relativity is needed. In cases where objects become extremely massive, general relativity becomes applicable. Some modern sources include relativistic mechanics and classical physics as representing the field in its most developed and accurate form. Back to the text. At the time under discussion, classical mechanics was considered the fundamental science of nature. It was hoped that mechanics would absorb other domains of physics and that this extension would make possible the reduction of chemistry and biology to mechanics. If the suggested reductions are actually successful, the suggested reductions would have affected our knowledge about the ultimate nature and constitution of things in general. Thus, for instance, the reduction of thermodynamics to statistical mechanics, successfully accomplished by a definitional assumption that temperature is the average kinetic energy of the constituent molecules, seem to support the view that all change is a change of place. According to Wikipedia, statistical mechanics In physics, statistical mechanics is a mathematical framework that applies statistical methods and probability theory to large assemblies of microscopic entities, sometimes called statistical physics or statistical thermodynamics. Its application include many problems in the fields of physics, biology, chemistry, neuroscience, computer science, information theory, and sociology. Its main purpose is to clarify the properties of matter in aggregate in terms of physical laws and governing atomic motion. Statistical mechanics arose out of the development of classical thermodynamics, a field for which it was successful in explaining macroscopic physical properties such as temperature, pressure, and heat capacity, in terms of microscopic parameters that fluctuate about average values and are characterized by probability distributions. While classical thermodynamics is primarily concerned with thermodynamic equilibrium, statistical mechanics has been applied in non-equilibrium statistical mechanics to the issues of microscopically modeling the speed of irreversible processes that are driven by imbalances. Examples of such processes include chemical reactions and flows of particles and heat. The fluctuation dissipation theorem is the basic knowledge obtained from applying non-equilibrium statistical mechanics to study the simplest non-equilibrium situation of a steady-state current flow in a system of many particles. I understood none of that. Thus, for instance, the reduction of thermodynamics to statistical mechanics. I'm not going to keep looking up shit like that. I can't follow it. Thus, for instance, the reduction of thermodynamics to statistical mechanics, successfully accomplished by a definitional assumption that temperature is the average kinetic energy of the constituent molecules, seemed to support the view that all change is a change of place. More generally, successful reductions of a less inclusive physical theory to a more inclusive one, ultimately based upon mechanics, appeared to justify the view that all qualitative differences given in experience are reducible to quantitative differences. Thus, only the latter should be regarded as real. See Engels' Dialectics of Nature. The mechanical conception claimed real knowledge of the material universe obtained by, or rather over and above, the results of its reductions. Engels' criticism of reductivism was prompted by epistemological and ontological considerations. The ontological reduction of one level of reality to another, or the epistemological reduction of science S1 to science S2, were in Engels' opinion unacceptable. Engels felt that the material world was not as homogeneous and constant as reductionism requires the material world to be. Mechanistic theories cannot explain the origin and processes of life. Thought may be correlated with molecular and chemical motions in the brain, but thought is not identical with these molecular and chemical motions in the brain. There is a gulf between animal and human activity, and no common set of laws describes both human and animal activity adequately. It was admissible to define chemistry as a kind of mechanics. It was inadmissible to define chemistry as a kind of mechanics. Mechanics knows only magnitudes. Mechanics deals with masses and velocities. In physics and chemistry, many qualitative changes have to be taken into account, and it remains to be shown that all of these are quantitative changes in disguise. The laws of mechanics remain valid in chemistry and biology, but the laws of mechanics are overshadowed by, quote, higher laws, end quote, characteristic of chemical and biological phenomena. There is both a connection and a distinction between chemistry and mechanics, a continuity and a discontinuity. As Engels explained elsewhere, quote, In spite of all gradualness, the transition from one form of motion to another form of motion always remains a leap, a decisive change, end quote. The fact that science moved in the direction of reductivism did not prove that this was the correct course or that it would, quote, exhaust the whole of physics and chemistry, end quote. Footnote. Engels' Dialectics of Nature is where the quotes are from. Also in the footnote, Engels wrote these words at a time when the leading scientists in Germany and elsewhere, Kirchhoff, Helmholtz, Dubois-Reymond, William Thomson, Lord Kelvin, and Clerk Maxwell were emphatically announcing that the reduction of all phenomena of nature to mechanics was the highest objective of natural science. For numerous striking quotations, see J.B. Stallo, The Concepts and Theories of Modern Physics, and E. Meyerson, Identity and Reality. End footnote. It is one thing to assume for certain purposes that heat is molecular motion, and another to assert that heat is nothing but a displacement of molecules. This is not merely a linguistic confusion, but also a logical and factual error. The fact that changes of temperature are correlated with the expansion and contraction of the mercury column does not imply that temperature is nothing but the height of the mercury column. Similarly, the statement that heat is correlated with molecular motion does not entail that heat is nothing but the physical conditions of heat's occurrence. If two phenomena are functionally related, the functional relation between these phenomena does not imply that the relation of identity between them has been established. Engels' views on reductivism were enlightened and advanced for the times. Footnote. Engels' criticism of the mechanistic conception does not compare unfavorably with Mach's critical observations in The Science of Mechanics, Chapter 5, first published in 1883, or with the philosophical analysis of the mechanistic conception of the universe in Stallo's The Concepts and Theories of Modern Physics, first published in 1881. Stallo and Mach are, of course, greatly superior to Engels in their knowledge of natural science. One second. Where the hell am I? End footnote. Engels' decisive arguments against reductivism are of a metaphysical nature. The mechanistic conception of nature is based on two fundamental conceptions. All change is change of place, and all qualitative differences result from quantitative differences. If we accept these two assumptions, we inevitably arrive at the doctrine of primordial indeterminate matter. Everything is an aggregate of, quote, identical smallest particles, end quote, and the differences in their configuration and number account for the whole variety of physical objects. This conclusion, however, goes beyond available evidence. Empirically, this doctrine can neither be confirmed nor refuted, and as has been mentioned earlier, lends to the mechanistic conception of nature an air of implausibility. Where am I? No amount of theorizing can dispose of the fact that there are qualitative differences and qualitative changes in nature which are irreducible to the displacement of the ultimate identical particles. Although he was a materialist, Engels was closer to the Aristotelian view of nature than to the physics of Democritus. Sorry, I had to look some things up. My internet cut out for a second, so I had to, I'm reading, some things that, weren't available, that I couldn't sorry, I'm spacing out right now. My internet cut out, I had to reset it. Yeah, so I had to, so I'm rereading the things I was looking up on the internet now. I sound insane. Okay. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Aristotle's natural philosophy says, Aristotle had a lifelong interest in the study of nature. Aristotle investigated a variety of different topics ranging from general issues like motion, causation, place, and time to systematic explorations and explanations of natural phenomena across different kinds of natural entities. These different inquiries are integrated into the framework of a single overarching enterprise describing the domain of natural entities. Aristotle provides the general theoretical framework for this enterprise in his Physics, a treatise which divides into two main parts, the first an inquiry into nature, books 1-4, and the second a treatment of motion, books 5-8. In this work, Aristotle sets out the conceptual apparatus for his analysis, provides definitions of his fundamental concepts, and argues for specific theses about motion, causation, place, and time, and establishes in Book 8 the existence of the unmoved mover of the universe, a supraphysical entity without which the physical domain could not remain in existence. Aristotle takes up problems of special interest to physics, such as the problem of generation and perishing, in a series of further physical treatises, some of which are devoted to particular physical domains, the De Generation et Corruption, on generation and perishing, the De Caelo, on the heavens, and the meteorology, which lead up to the treatises on biology and psychology. The science of physics, Aristotle stresses, contains almost all there is to know about the world. Were there no separate forms, entities such as the unmoved mover at the pinnacle of the cosmos, which are without matter and are not part of the physical world, physics would be what Aristotle calls first philosophy. As there are such separate entities, physics is dependent on these and is only a second philosophy. Nevertheless, the interaction between these two, quote, philosophies is not completely exhausted by the causal influence exerted on the world by the supraphysical entities, the prime movers, as it turns out. Aristotle's metaphysics and physics use a common conceptual framework, and they often address similar issues. The prime and distinctive task of first philosophy is an inquiry into first entities. These, however, are not perceptible entities. As a result, they have to be investigated through a metaphysical investigation of physical entities. Hence the overlap between the two disciplines, which often verges on inseparability. Back to the text. Footnote. In this respect, Engels and similarly Lenin did not depart from the views and preferences of Marx, who put the, quote, blooming sensuousness, end quote, of Bacon above Hobbes' quote, abstract sensuousness of the geometrician, end quote. Whatever matter is, Bacon wrote, it must be so formed that, quote, all virtues, essences, action, and motion may be the natural consequence and emanation thereof, end quote. Quoted by J.B. Stalin in The Concepts and Theories of Modern Physics. Lenin followed Engels' conception of matter both for temperamental and philosophical reasons. Quote, the very first and most familiar to us is sensation, and in it there is inevitably also quality, end quote. Lenin, Philosophical Notebooks. End footnote. The implausibility of the view that all diversity is in reality quantitative difference becomes still more apparent owing to the clash of the mechanistic conception of nature and the idea of evolution. It is possible to describe a natural object, be it animate or inanimate, as if it were the product of purely mechanical causes, but it is not possible to describe that natural object simultaneously as a machine and as a developing entity. Footnote. See R.G. Collingwood, The Idea of Nature. A machine cannot become what a machine is not. That is, a machine cannot develop. Growth and advance is a process of progressive change which results in the emergence of new things or qualities. The mechanistic conception of nature was based on 18th century natural science which, to use Engels' expression, quote, accepted things as finished objects, end quote. On the other hand, in the 19th century, natural science is essentially, quote, a science of the processes of the origin and development of these things, and of the interconnection which binds all these natural processes into one great whole, end quote. Biology concerned with the growth of the individual organism, evolutionary cosmogony, and geology, the biological doctrine of evolution, all these were the offspring of the 19th century. The establishment of evolution as a pervading trait of physical and social reality clearly meant that the mechanistic conception had to be abandoned and replaced by what Engels called the, quote, dialectical conception of nature, end quote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach. Its abandonment, the mechanistic conception's abandonment was necessary for yet another reason. It was Newton who clearly saw that a mechanical world would require a transcendent God as that mechanical world's designer, creator, and ruler. God prevents the heaven of fixed stars from collapsing into the middle of space and the mechanism of the world from running out of gear. The idea of nature as a machine is incompatible with materialistic monism, for the idea of nature as a machine cannot be applied consistently without incurring absurd consequences. A machine presupposes the constructor who conceived and built the machine. As Gilson put it, quote, there is no known example of a self-made machine spontaneously arising in virtue of the mechanical laws of matter, end quote. This is really something I've never ever even thought about in my life. A machine presupposes the constructor who conceived and built it. As Gilson put it, quote, there is no known example of a self-made machine spontaneously arising in virtue of the mechanical laws of matter, end quote. Gilson. Footnote. E. Gilson, God and Philosophy. Let's see who this Gilson is. It's Etienne Gilson, I guess is how you actually say it. Maybe not, I don't know. Etienne Gilson is a French philosopher and historian of philosophy. Wikipedia says Etienne Henri Gilson was a French philosopher and historian of philosophy, a scholar of medieval philosophy, Etienne Gilson originally specialized in the thought of Descartes, Etienne Gilson also philosophized in the tradition of Thomas Aquinas, although he did not consider himself a neo-Thomist philosopher. In 1946, Etienne Gilson attained the distinction of being elected an, quote, immortal, end quote, member of the Académie Française. Etienne Gilson was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature. In 2009, the International Etienne Gilson Society was created, quote, to promote the thought of Etienne Gilson and classical philosophy in the academy and culture, end quote. The International Etienne Gilson Society publishes a journal, Studia Gilsoniana. So that's who Gilson is. A machine presupposes, back to the text, a machine presupposes the conductor who conceived and built the machine, as Gilson put it, quote, there is no known example of a self-made machine spontaneously arising in virtue of the mechanical laws of matter, end quote. German materialists of the 19th century believed that those German materialists of the 19th century could remedy this defect of mechanistic materialism by producing new proofs against the existence of a creator of the world. Their efforts were irrelevant with respect to this basic flaw of mechanistic materialism. Marx, in a contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, and Engels in Ludwig Feuerbach, both recognized that Feuerbach had made a step forward by explaining how men come to believe in God's existence. But Feuerbach's anthropology could not and did not dispose of natural theology. Laplace made a considerable contribution to the problem at issue when he showed that in his Traité de mécanique céleste that the quote entire natural world is governed by law and absolutely excludes the intervention of action from without, end quote. One second. According to Wikipedia, Traité de mécanique céleste, which translates as Treatise of Celestial Mechanics, is a 5-volume treatise on celestial mechanics written by Pierre Simon Laplace, and published from 1798 to 1825, the second edition in 1829. In 1842, the government of Louis Philippe gave a grant of 40,000 francs for a 7-volume national edition of Oeuvres de Laplace. 1843 to 1847, the Traité de mécanique céleste, with its 4 supplements, occupies the first 5 volumes. Newton laid the foundations of celestial mechanics at the close of the 17th century by the discovery of the principle of universal gravitation. Even in his own hands, this discovery led to important consequences, but it has required a century and a half and a regular succession of intellects, the most powerful, to fill out the outlines sketched by him. Of these, Laplace himself was the last, and perhaps after Newton, the greatest, and the task commenced in the Principia of the former is completed in the Mécanique Céleste of the latter. In this last named work, the illustrious author has proposed to himself his object, to unite all the theories scattered throughout the various channels of publication employed by his predecessors, to reduce them to one common method, and present them all in the same point of view. I don't know if that was a quote or not. I don't know if this is all a quote, or because it's indented, but it doesn't really say. I don't know, those kind of flavorful for a Wikipedia entry. If one were asked to name the two most important works in the okay, see, that's not Wikipedia tone. If one were asked to name the 2 most important works in the progress of mathematics and physics, the answer would undoubtedly be the Principia of Newton and the Mécanique Céleste of Laplace. In their historical and philosophical aspects, these works easily outrank all others, and furnish thus the standard by which all others must be measured. The distinguishing feature of the Principia is its clear and exhaustive enunciation of fundamental principles. The Mécanique Céleste, on the other hand, is conspicuous for the development of principles and for the profound generality of its method. The Principia gives the plans and specifications of the foundations. The Mécanique Céleste affords the key to the vast and complex superstructure. Anyway, back to the text. Laplace made a considerable contribution to the problem at issue when he showed in his Traité de Mécanique Céleste that the, quote, entire natural world is governed by law and absolutely excludes the intervention of action from without, end quote. Laplace established that Newton had not succeeded in doing. Laplace demonstrated that the movements of the planets in our solar system were deducible from the law of gravitation. The remaining discrepancies were so small that it was considered certain that they would be removed either by improved observation or by a correction of calculations. Engels argued that while Laplace reduced the difficulty inherent in the mechanistic conception, he did not dispose of it altogether. Engels showed that the universe was in no need of a ruler, but failed to demonstrate that it required no creator. However, if we accept the new materialism and its dynamic theory of matter, then this difficulty disappears. If matter were not in motion but could exist at rest, if motion were not an essential property of matter, and if matter without motion were not just as inconceivable as motion without matter, we would not be able to get from immobile matter to matter in motion without an impulse from outside. That is, we could not do without God. But once the corpuscular theory of matter is replaced by the dynamic theory and the assumption of the invariability of natural forces by the idea of the transformation of energy, quote, the last vestige of the extra-mundane creator is obliterated, end quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. Footnote. The corpuscular theory of matter, sometimes designated also as the expression the kinetic corpuscular theory, because it tries to explain natural phenomena in terms of mass and motion, assumed that matter consisted of ultimate and invariable particles, and that the forces of nature, attraction, heat, chemical, electric, or magnetic energy, which acted upon these particles, were also unchangeable. For the classical formulation of these axioms, see Descartes' Principia Philosophia. 2. Chapter 37. On the other hand, the dynamic theory of matter defined atoms and molecules as centers of a force, which was not extraneous, impressed upon a material particle from outside as in the corpuscular theory. End footnote. The evolutionary conception of the universe achieves what even Laplace failed to accomplish. The evolutionary conception of the universe requires neither a ruler nor a creator. When Engels referred to the evolutionary conception of the universe, Engels meant not only the dynamic conception of matter, but also the hypothesis of emergent evolution. This new doctrine, based on the convertibility of force and motion, which were attributed to matter as its intrinsic primary characteristic, was to provide an alternative to the mechanistic view of nature. Matter was no longer conceived as immutable, inherently passive, and entirely lacking in spontaneity. Physicists like John Tyndall discerned in it, quote, the promise and potency of every form and quality of life, end quote, and Engels might have recognized in their announcements a view similar to the idea of the young Marx, who had once attributed to matter not only mechanical motion, but also, quote, impulse, vital life force, tension, end quote, as the first and most important of its inherent qualities. Wikipedia says John Tyndall, who lived from 1820 to 1893, was a prominent 19th century Irish physicist. John Tyndall's scientific fame arose in the 1850s from his study of diamagnetism. Later, John Tyndall made discoveries in the realms of infrared radiation and the physical properties of air, proving the connection between atmospheric CO2 and what is now known as the greenhouse effect in 1859. Tyndall also published more than a dozen science books, which brought state-of-the-art 19th century experimental physics to a wide audience. From 1853 to 1887, he was professor of physics at the Royal Institution of Great Britain in London. He was selected as a member of the American Philosophical Society in 1868. Back to the text. Footnote. Quoted from John Tyndall's presidential address to the British Association for the Advancement of Science, delivered at the meeting held in Belfast in August 1874, which became known as the, quote, Belfast Address, end quote. It was published in Nature, the journal, and reprinted in Tyndall's two-volume work, Fragments of Science, published in 1881. John Tyndall, who lived from 1820 to 1893, was Faraday's successor at the Royal Institution and was noted for his interest in philosophy. The Belfast Address acquired a considerable renown and provoked many rejoinders on account of its outspoken criticism of theology. Engels studied it carefully. See Engels' letter to Marx of the 21st of September 1874 and Dialectics of Nature, page 268-9. End footnote. Although people continue to regard the mechanistic conception of nature as applicable to the totality of natural phenomena and as unexcelled by its internal consistency and its empirical confirmation, they showed thereby, in Engels' opinion, a lack of acquaintance with any but the, quote, most mediocre vulgar philosophy, end quote. Inert matter of the mechanistic theory, which neither acts upon our senses nor upon our other bodies, must remain unknown to experience. Whatever does not act does not exist. Moreover, apart from the fact that we are able to know matter only by matter's effects, matter is a principle of differentiation in space. As Marx said, matter includes the, quote, individualizing forces of being, end quote, which reduce the distinction between the species, the form of life, and the form of life which evolved from matter by self-generated development. This dynamic property of matter is incompatible with its being absolutely inert. A, quote, motionless state of matter is therefore one of the most empty and nonsensical of ideas, end quote. Engels. Anti-during. Footnote. See E. Meyerson, Identity and Reality. Modern supporters of emergent evolution continue to show as much hostility towards mechanistic theories as did Engels. See C. Lloyd Morgan, Emergent Evolution. They point out that the doctrine of emergence is an alternative to the mechanistic conception not only on the ontological but on the epistemological level. The mechanistic conception would have to be a theory of an unlimited range of validity, and such a theory could hardly meet the methodological requirements which every scientific theory should satisfy. End footnote. The doctrine of emergent evolution should be distinguished from a narrow conception which is concerned with emergent qualities or emergent laws. A quality or a law is emergent if it cannot be deduced from previously known qualities or laws before an instance of the quality or law in question is observed. Being unpredictable before the event, such qualities or laws are also called, quote, a priori unpredictable, end quote. For instance, the smell of a new chemical compound is an emergent quality, for the smell of a new chemical compound cannot be foretold from the knowledge of the properties which the separate elements of the compound are known to have. The doctrine of emergent evolution is a hypothesis concerned with novelties, which are not mere new combinations of their component elements, and which are supposed to occur in the course of natural development, such as the emergence of life or of mind. The strict doctrine of causality is a theory of change without novelty. It may account for novelty in number and in quantity alone, but it precludes the possibility of the emergence of qualitative novelty, of things with new properties and of objects new in kind, at least as a natural event. Footnote, see M. Bunge, Causality. End footnote. The hypothesis of emergent evolution brings to light the fact that in a genuine evolution the resultant process is continuous with, but not reducible to, the phenomena from which it evolves, and that it contains more than its causes are supposed to produce. Consequently, the theory of change, in terms of which evolutionary processes could be adequately described, should impose some limitations upon causal determinism. In contradistinction to the strict doctrine of causality, the hypothesis of emergent evolution starts with the assumption that the successive stages of evolutionary development are marked by an increasingly complex and irreducible novel structures, in virtue of which natural entities or natural entities systems acquire new intrinsic qualities and new properties in relation to other entities. When such processes take place, new levels of existence may appear and reveal the emergence of some specific and qualitatively new modes of being. The doctrine of emergent evolution assumes, therefore, that the present qualitative diversity of things in the world represents an advance from a less complex stage in the development of the universe, and that this development will continue to give rise to novelty of increasing complexity. Footnote, quote, novelties, end quote, in the sense in which this term is used in this context mean, quote, entities or properties temporally or historically novel, end quote. What is temporally novel is also a priori unpredictable, but a priori unpredictable novelties are not necessarily historically novel. Lloyd Morgan emphasized that we may speak of original novelty only when it arises on some first occasion, that is, when we think of the cosmic process as a whole. Unpredictability characterizes, quote, this or that bit of world process, end quote, in which some original novelty reappears as a matter of established routine. End footnote. It also assumes that, quote, real evolution, end quote, is as inconsistent with the uniform continuity as with the discontinuous emergence of novelty, ex nihilo, and, more generally, that both continuity and discontinuity are inherent traits of the world. The wide use of the expression, quote, emergent evolution is some 40 years older than anti-Düring, but those who take Hegel seriously, and Engels was one such, firmly believe that the general scheme of life as emerging from matter and mind from life has become a commonplace since Hegel. Footnote, see R.G. Collingwood, The Idea of Nature. There is ample evidence to support the view that Engels' conception of emergent evolution was closely related to Hegel's dialectics, conceived as an objective dynamic tendency that, quote, forces nature out of itself, end quote. Footnote, see Chapter 3. This is also apparent from Engels' Hegelian terminology. Engels spoke of the nodal lines of measure relations, or qualitative leap, and of the forms of motion irreducible to each other, when Engels had the emergence and the stratification of levels in mind. End footnote. Moreover, it should be noted that the concept of emergence in its present connotation is contemporaneous with anti-Düring, both concept and term appearing in G.H. Lewis's Problems of Life and Mind, published in 1875. Who the hell is G.H. Lewis? According to Wikipedia, George Henry Lewis lived from 1817 to 1878. George Henry Lewis was an English philosopher and critic of literature and theater. George Henry Lewis was an amateur physiologist. American feminist Margaret Fuller called Lewis a, quote, witty, French, flippant sort of man, end quote. George Henry Lewis became part of the mid-Victorian ferment of ideas which encouraged discussion of Darwinism, positivism, and religious skepticism. However, George Henry Lewis is perhaps best known today for having openly lived with Mary Ann Evans, who wrote under the pen name George Eliot, as soulmates whose lives and writings were enriched by their relationship, though they never married each other. So that's George Henry Lewis. Let's look up his book. Not really seeing anything for his book. Yeah, not seeing anything. Back to the text. Moreover, it should be noted that the concept of emergence's present connotation is contemporaneous with ante-during, both concept and term appearing in George Henry Lewis's Problems of Life and Mind, published in 1875. But irrespective of the question as to where to look for Engels' forerunners and inspirations, the fact cannot be denied that the central idea of emergent evolution is to be found in ante-during and Dialectics of Nature. The central idea of emergent evolution is the logical product of the three following assumptions. Material reality has a multi-level structure. Each of these levels is characterized by a set of distinctive properties and irreducible laws, and each level has emerged from temporarily prior levels according to laws which are absolutely unpredictable with respect to those operating at the lower levels. Footnote. See S. Alexander, Space, Time, and Deity, Volume 2. C. Lloyd Morgan, Emergent Evolution, pages 19 to 20. C. D. Broad, The Mind and the Mind's Place in Nature, Chapter 2. P. E. Meal and W. Sellers, The Concept of Emergence. End footnote. These levels can be considered either epistemologically as the levels of scientific knowledge, such as physics, chemistry, biology, sociology, and so forth, or ontologically as the corresponding objective structural levels of the external world. In the case of Engels, the emphasis is clearly laid upon the ontological conception, upon the gradual emergence of the atomic, chemical, and biological level, the latter with its numerous emergent transitions to higher and higher forms of life. Engels made constant use of the metaphysical insight that the higher level of existence emerges from and has that higher level of existence's roots in the lower, that the higher level constitutes a new order of being with that higher level's own irreducible laws, and that this process of evolutionary advance is governed by laws of development which reflect basic properties of, quote, matter and motion as a whole, end quote. According to Engels, the capacity of differentiating the motion of matter and of transforming matter into various forms, those of, quote, heat and light, electric and magnetic tension, chemical combination and dissociation, life and finally consciousness, end quote, is, quote, inherent in moving matter, end quote. The three great discoveries of natural science, the law of the transformation and conservation of energy, the discovery of the cell, and Darwin's theory of descent, which show the whole of nature as a system of interconnected bodies, reveal the fundamental fact that the emergence of novelty is an essential attribute of matter. Quote, It is in the nature of matter, end quote. Engels wrote, quote, to advance to the evolution of thinking beings. Hence this always necessarily occurs when the conditions for it, not necessarily identical at all places and times, are present, end quote. Engels' Dialectics of Nature. Section 3. The Doctrine of Dialectics. Engels' doctrine of emergent evolution is part of his dialectical conception of nature. Quote, dialectics, Engels repeatedly stated, quote, is the science of interconnections, end quote. Dialectics deals with systems of physical bodies which exist in relations of mutual interdependence. What these relations of interdependence are is expressed in the dialectical laws. The laws of dialectics do not apply to particular material objects taken in isolation, quote, for in nature nothing takes place in isolation, end quote, but to parts of a functional whole whose characteristics are determined by the intrinsic nature of this whole. The dialectical laws are therefore holistic laws. Engels knew three laws of dialectics: the law of the transformation of quantity into quality and vice versa, and the law of the interpenetration of opposites, and the law of the negation, although their first formulation by Hegel was in Engels' opinion an act of historical import, Hegel's achievement was not free from serious faults. First, instead of deducing these laws from natural phenomena and historical developments, Hegel produced them out of his head and then foisted the creation of his own mind upon nature, history, and society. Second, Hegel conceived them as, quote, mere laws of thought, end quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. On his part, Engels was convinced first that the laws of dialectics are universally valid and empirically verifiable laws, and second, that these laws apply as much to the development of thought as to the development of nature and human society. Quote, the dialectical laws, end quote, Engels wrote, quote, are real laws of the development of nature and therefore are valid also for theoretical natural science, end quote. Engels, Dialectics of Nature. Thus dialectics, which, as a, quote, law of thought, end quote, could serve as a tentative way of describing the development of intellectual conceptions about the world, becomes with Engels a general theory of the world established upon the basis of natural science. For the empirical viewpoint, this is a fantastic idea, for Hegelian dialectics has no empirical significance. This has already been emphasized in the past. Werner Sombart thought that the dialectics of Hegel becomes absolutely meaningless when the dialectics of Hegel is applied to the empirical world. Jean-Paul Sartre said of Engels that Engels, quote, a tué la dialectique en prétendant la découvrir dans la nature, end quote. Let's see what that means. Translates as Jean-Paul Sartre said of Engels that Engels, quote, killed dialectic by claiming to discover dialectic in nature. So that's what that last bit translates to. Pretty presumptuous for the author to assume we know French, but that quote's from Jean-Paul Sartre, Critique des raisons dialectique, which is a critique of dialectical reason, I believe. And the footnote says, however, Sartre did not object to the application of dialectics to nature because of the inherent nonsense of applying dialectics to nature, nor did Jean-Paul Sartre exclude the possibility that the dialectics of nature was a valid metaphysical hypothesis. Jean-Paul Sartre objected to Engels' version of dialectical materialism, which he called le materialisme dialectique du dehors, which translates as motherfucker. Dialectical materialism from outside. Since Engels' version of dialectical materialism distorted the anthropological content of this doctrine, in the doctrine being dialectical materialism's, in dialectical materialism's original Marxian formulation, and subjected the nature of man to a principle which lies outside of man's self, namely to the universal laws of nature. End footnote. The law of the transformation of quantity into quality includes two statements. The first of these says that the quality of a body cannot be altered without addition or subtraction of matter or motion in a manner exactly fixed for each individual case, i.e., without quantitative alteration of the body concerned. Since it was not Engels' intention to assert that, since it was not Engels' intention to assert that every, quote, addition or subtraction of motion, end quote, produces qualitative change, the first part of the law formulates only the necessary condition of the emergence of a new quality. Without saying what its sufficient condition is, the second statement claims that at certain nodal points, such as the boiling and freezing points of liquids, the critical melting temperature of metals, or the temperature of liquefaction of gases, the, quote, purely quantitative increase or decrease gives rise to a qualitative leap, end quote. That is, the mere quantitative change of a body brings about a qualitative change in a body. To give the well-known example, water under normal atmospheric pressure changes at 0 degrees Celsius from the liquid state into the solid state, and at 100 degrees Celsius from the liquid into the gaseous state. The temperatures of water at 0 degrees Celsius and 100 degrees Celsius are the nodes at which the leaps to new stages of aggregation take place, and, quote, quantity is transformed into quality, end quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. Engels' other examples, together with his comments thereon, suggest that no new quality appears unless a new structure emerges with the quantitative change, quote, as, for example, the fact that the cooperation of a number of people, the fusion of many forces into one single force, creates, to use Marx's phrase, a, quote, new power, end quote, which is essentially different from the sum of its separate forces, end quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. In this case, a new whole with an intrinsic nature of that new whole's own suddenly emerges upon the quantitative change and gives rise to a novel quality. The first law of dialectics applies to alteration or qualitative transformation. Alloiosis, but serves to account, above all, for substantial change, genesis, as defined by Aristotle. According to Aristotle, qualitative change involves only properties of a thing whose substance remains unaffected, for instance, the properties of water when water passes from one state into another. On the other hand, genesis is creative of a new substance and of new characteristics different from and irreducible to the properties to be found in the elements taken separately. Aristotle's genesis is the same kind of essential change which today is known as appearance of novelty. Aristotle's genesis is the same kind of essential change which today is known as appearance of novelty, and his analysis of substantial change deals with the same phenomena which the theory of emergent evolution tries to explain. It is no accident that Engels placed the law of the transformation of quantity into quality and vice versa before the other two. The law in question clearly differentiates mechanistic and dialectical materialism. It expresses Engels' anti-reductivist attitude and his belief that there is no reason to accept Galileo's methodological decision to consider only primary qualities, the geometric and mechanical magnitudes, as real, and secondary qualities as merely apparent. Engels endorsed wholeheartedly Hegel's view that if quality is compared with quantity, quality is by nature prior to quantity. Engels endorsed wholeheartedly Hegel's view that if quality is compared with quantity, quality is by nature prior to quantity. Qualities are as real as quantities, and among qualities there are not only additive and subtractive properties, but also emergent characteristics. Qualitative diversity and qualitative transformation belong to the nature of things and are not mere additions to experience dependent upon the constitution of the perceiving mind. But the law of the transformation of quantity into quality is not merely a statement about the irreducibility of sensible qualities or the inadequacy of the purely quantitative approach to natural phenomena which paved the way for the mathematical and mechanistic conception of nature. The law is clearly meant to state an invariant connection between the increase and decrease in quantity and the change in quality, between the quantitative and qualitative definiteness of natural phenomena. Engels himself considered the law as firmly moored in direct observation and confirmed by, quote, hundreds of facts, end quote, provided by the natural and social sciences. Engels, Anti-Düring. It is in this capacity, as a, quote, general law of nature, society, and thought, end quote, that its claim to universal validity should be investigated. Footnote. See Sidney Hook, Reason, Social Myths, and Democracy, and H.B. Acton, The Illusion of the Epoch, where Engels' claim is examined from this point of view. End footnote. The role assigned by Engels to the law of transformation of quantity into quality admits yet another interpretation. Engels' instances of the law taken from physics, chemistry, economics, and Napoleon's military tactics seems to suggest that what Engels had in mind was not merely a law-like correlational statement, but above all a doctrine of evolutionary advance. Evolutionary advance is marked by the emergence of primary novelties and by the production of qualitatively different bodies. For instance, the first occasion on which a certain combination of oxygen and hydrogen took place on the surface of Earth to form a new substance, water. Footnote. A primary novelty should be distinguished from a recurrent novelty, the novel occurrence being repeated on subsequent occasions. End footnote. What Engels says about the transformation of quantity into quality at certain definite nodal points, namely that the transformation combines a purely quantitative increase or decrease with a qualitative leap, suggests that Engels may have wished to formulate a law of evolutionary cosmology. Footnote. That the transformation of quantity into quality explains the emergence of novelty is the view widely adopted in Soviet philosophy. End footnote. Thus interpreted, the law of the transformation of quantity into quality would be a statement concerned with the necessary conditions of the emergence of novelty, rather than with the irreducibility of qualities to quantities, or with the connection between the two. The hypothesis of emergent advance does not deal with sensible qualities, such as colors or heat, but with the distinctively different behavior of various natural bodies, above all those which are alive and those which are not, and within the organic matrix, with the qualities of consciousness and reflective thought. The law of the interpenetration of opposites and the law of the negation, neither of which was ever formulated by Engels in a general way, can be discussed together. The first law provides the presupposition on which the second is based. Namely, it states that the world is full of contradictions, quote, in, so to speak, corporeal form, end quote. The instances of contradictions present in things and phenomena of nature, which Engels gave, clearly indicate that Engels wished to make the statement, all changing objects and all objects in motion are contradictory. An object O is contradictory if only that object O has and has not an attribute B in the same respect and at the same time. But if there are contradictory objects, the principle of non-contradiction has to be abandoned or restricted. A conjunction of contradictory statements is no longer necessarily a falsehood. Footnote. During and many writers after During expressed their shocked amazement at Engels' use of the term, quote, contradiction, which allows us to predicate it both of propositions and of things or events. See Engels' Anti-During, Sidney Hook, Reason, Social Myths, and Democracy. There is no reason to be amazed, for we can speak as Aristotle did of contradictory objects at the ontological level and of contradictory statements or propositions at the linguistic level. If the logical or metalogical semantical principle of non-contradiction is accepted, the existence of contradictory objects has to be rejected and conversely. But those restricting or denying the validity of the principle of non-contradiction are perfectly free to speak of contradictory objects. End footnote. The law of the negation is the Hegelian triad, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, in which thesis and antithesis are merged, and for the first, quote, negation stands for, quote, negation of the thesis. That is, for, quote, antithesis, and, quote, negation of the negation, for, quote, synthesis, end quote. Since the law of the negation is based upon the assumption that contradictions are objectively present in nature, Plekhanov was not entirely wrong when Plekhanov said that the triad, quote, only follows from one of Hegel's principles. It does not in the least serve Hegel as a main principle itself, end quote. Plekhanov. Plekhanov had some doubts about the correspondence of the triadic course of development to reality, but Engels had no doubts about the correspondence of the triadic course of development to reality. Engels claimed that contradictions are the cause of all change and motion, and that development which occurs by agency of the dialectical triad is therefore, quote, development through contradiction, end quote, and constitutes a, quote, spiral form, end quote, of evolutionary advance. The law of the triad is universal. As Engels put it, the law of the triad is, quote, an extremely general, and for this reason, extremely far-reaching and important law of the development of nature, history, and thought, end quote. Engels. The development through contradiction or the negation of the negation, quote, asserts itself everywhere in nature, end quote, and determines all change, motion, growth, and evolutionary advance. Footnote. Engels, Dialectics of Nature. End footnote. There is no doubt whatsoever that to admit, as Engels did, quote, the objective presence in things and processes themselves of a contradiction which is moreover an actual force, end quote, is to adopt a Hegelian doctrine. Footnote. Engels, Anti-During. End footnote. For Hegel, the power that impels change is the, quote, negativity, end quote, of things. Any self-movement or impulse, Hegel asserted, is nothing else than the fact that something is itself and is also deficiency or the negation of that something self. In one and the same respect. This is a quote. Any self-movement or impulse, Hegel asserted, quote, is nothing else than the fact that something is that something self and is also deficiency or the negation, or the negative of that something's self. In one and the same respect. Abstract self-identity has no life, but the fact that positive in itself is negativity, causes it to pass outside itself and to change. Something, therefore, has life only insofar as that something contains contradiction, with a capital C. End quote. Hegel, Science of Logic. Since everything that surrounds us is, according to Hegel, a, quote, instance of the dialectical process, end quote, of the universal and irresistible power before which nothing stays and by which everything becomes changeable and transient, quote, there is absolutely nothing whatever in which we cannot and must not point to contradictions or opposite attributes, end quote. Hegel. Quote, contradiction is the very moving principle of the world, and it is ridiculous to say that contradiction is unthinkable. The only thing correct in that statement is that contradiction is not the end of the matter, but cancels contradiction's self. End quote. Hegel. What Hegel had in mind was not only the, quote, motion of thoughts, end quote, but also actual change and movement in space. As Hegel emphasized, quote, something moves not because something is here at one point of time and there at another point of time, but because at one and the same point of time that something is here and not here, and in this here both is and is not. But we must grant the old dialecticians the contradictions which the old dialecticians proved in motion. What follows is not that there is no motion, but rather that motion is existent contradiction itself. End quote. Hegel. Science of Logic. Footnote. Hegel believed that Zeno of Elea did not mean to deny the reality of movement, for the fact that there is movement is, quote, as sensuously certain as there are elephants, end quote. Zeno intended to show that, quote, the conception of movement involves a contradiction, end quote, and pointed out, quote, how movement must necessarily be determined, end quote. See Hegel, Lectures on the History of Philosophy. End footnote. These views of Hegel were adopted by Engels almost verbally. So long as we consider things as being at rest and lifeless, we do not run up against any contradictions in them. Quote, but the position is quite different as soon as we consider things in their motion, in things change, in things life, in things reciprocal influence on one another. Then we immediately become involved in contradictions. Motion itself is a contradiction. Even simple mechanical change of position can only come about through a body being at one and the same moment of time, both in one place and in another place, being in one and the same place and also not being in one and the same place. And the continuous organization and simultaneous solution of this contradiction is precisely what motion is. End quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. Scientific thinking, which is abreast of the advancement of knowledge, does not let, quote, the contradiction, ... block its path, end quote. Contradictions are inherent in simple change of place, in the higher forms of motion, and especially in organic life. All development results from, quote, progressing contradictions, end quote. Quote, life is also a contradiction which is present in things and processes themselves, and which constantly originates and resolves it, life's self. And as soon as the contradiction ceases, life too comes to an end, and death steps in, end quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. In his Dialectics of Nature, Engels stated generally that, quote, so-called objective dialectics prevails throughout nature, end quote. Engels defined objective dialectics as the motion through opposites which clash and pass into one another or into higher forms. Engels objected strongly, however, to an interpretation which would reduce objective dialectics to the, quote, platitude of forces moving in opposite directions, of antagonistic or conflicting tendencies, and of opposing interests. Mere, quote, antagonism of forces, end quote, is no contradiction. If two opposite poles act upon a body, as often happens, there would be, quote, opposition, end quote, but no contradiction, between the two propositions which express this fact and which are both true. Engels does not quarrel with ordinary logic in such cases, but conflicts of tendencies and similar complex phenomena should be contrasted with objective contradictions, an instance of which would be provided by the propositions asserting about the same body B with respect to the same frame of reference, and at the same time that, quote, B is moving to the south, end quote, and, quote, B is moving to the north, end quote. According to ordinary logic, these propositions cannot be true together, but according to Engels, these propositions are both true. Engels insisted on the fact that things change or move because of such contradictions, of having contradictory attributes in the same respect and at the same time. Contradiction is only nonsense to a metaphysician who adheres to antiquated logic and science with their rigid categories and hard and fast lines of division in thought and nature. To penetrate into what Hegel called the, quote, inner unity of all existence, end quote, and Engels the, quote, dialectics of nature, end quote, the principles of identity and of the excluded middle have to be replaced by the principle of contradiction. Quote, It has been a fundamental prejudice of hitherto existing logic and of ordinary imagination that contradiction is a determination having less essence and immanence than identity. But indeed, if there were any question of rank, and the two determinations had to be fixed as separate, contradiction would have to be taken as the profounder and more fully essential. For as opposed to contradiction, identity is only the determination of the simple immediate, or of dead being, while contradiction is the root of all movement and life. And it is only insofar as life contains a contradiction that anything moves and has impulse and activity, end quote. And it is only insofar as it contains a contradiction that anything moves and has impulse and activity. I think I misread that last sentence. I'm going to repeat it, sorry. For as opposed to contradiction, identity is only the determination of the simple immediate, or of dead being, while contradiction is the root of all movement and life. And it is only insofar as it contains a contradiction that anything moves and has impulse and activity, end quote. Hegel, Science of Logic. Speculative philosophy replaces the maximum of understanding, quote, everything is essentially distinct, end quote, by speculative philosophy's own, quote, everything is opposite, end quote, neither in the world of mind nor nature. Hegel wrote, is there anywhere such an abstract, quote, either or, end quote, or understanding maintains, quote, whatever exists is concrete with difference and opposition in itself, end quote. Hegel. Engels endorsed these Hegelian views also with the full confidence that Engels was paving the way for scientific progress. Common sense may protest against identifying things which are different, for, quote, abstract identity, end quote, like other metaphysical categories, suffices for everyday use. But the law of identity implies that nothing changes, and this consequence is, quote, refuted by natural science bit by bit in each separate case, end quote. Therefore, nothing is simply identical with that thing's self, but that thing is both identical with and becoming distinct from itself. Quote, concrete identity, end quote, which replaces the abstract kind, quote, includes difference, end quote. That identity contains difference within identity's self is made clear by the simplest statement, quote, the lily is a plant, end quote, or, quote, the rose is red, end quote, in which the predicate is necessarily different from the subject. Engels accepted Hegel's view that the connective, quote, is, end quote, in the proposition, quote, the rose is red, end quote, does not signify the relation of class inclusion, but that of identity. Consequently, in Hegel's own words, the proposition in question, quote, affirms that the individual, or subject, is after all not individual but universal, end quote. Everything is itself and something else at the same time. It is, therefore, contradiction. Footnote. See Engels' anti-during Dialectics of Nature, some pages, blah, blah, blah. Lenin followed in Engels' footsteps. Lenin commented with admiration upon the passages of the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences quoted above, and stated that facts described by the proposition in which, quote, the individual is the universal, end quote, e.g., quote, John is a man, end quote, or, quote, Fido is a dog, end quote, reveal the, quote, materialist roots, end quote, of Hegel's, quote, dialectic of motion, end quote. End footnote. Thus, however, the validity of the law of the excluded middle has to be restricted. Valid scientific thinking, quote, besides, quote, either or, end quote, recognizes also in the right place, quote, both this and that, end quote, and reconciles the opposites, end quote. To, quote, think in irreconcilable antitheses, end quote, is a metaphysical, that is, an anti-dialectical manner of philosophizing. To the metaphysician, a thing either exists or does not exist. It cannot at the same time be itself and something else. This may be good enough for every day, but not for scientific purposes, for science reveals that, quote, nature works dialectically and not metaphysically, end quote. Engels, anti-during. The law of the negation is more closely associated with the Hegelian philosophy than either of the two previously considered laws, and is often simply identified with the dialectical method. In this restricted sense, dialectics is a theory and a schema. The schema is the dialectical triad, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, the three inevitable stages in the development of ideas. The theory is a single statement to the effect that the development of social movements in human thought in art and science, religion, and philosophy always occur by agency of the dialectical triad. This single statement expresses a belief about intellectual history which, unrestricted, does not appear to be valid. Moreover, Hegel's and Engels' treatment of events to be fitted into the triadic schema gives the impression of considerable arbitrariness. The methodological vagueness and arbitrary character of the triadic interpretation are very apparent in Engels' example, in which he intended to show how the antithetical triad procedure is able to reveal the dialectical advance in philosophy. The philosophy of antiquity, Engels argued, was natural materialism, unable to solve the problem of the relation of mind to matter. The philosophy of antiquity, natural materialism, was negated by monotheism and idealism, which in turn became untenable and were negated by modern materialism. Modern materialism, being the negation of old materialism, preserves the permanent foundation of the old materialism and enriches the permanent foundation, modern materialism, being the negation of old materialism, preserves the permanent foundation of the latter, old materialism, and enriches the latter, old materialism, with the achievements of philosophy and natural science over 2,000 years of history. Footnote. Popper has suggested that the theory of the dialectical triad should be regarded as an empirical descriptive theory comparable, for instance, with Comte's law of the three stages, or with the belief that opinions are held first dogmatically, then skeptically, and finally critically. See Popper's Conjectures and Refutations. Such theories provide only a rough chart of intellectual history and have therefore little cognitive value. End footnote. The extension of the law of the triad to the world of nature rests on the presupposition that there are contradictory objects. These are the objects which, to use Engels' expression, are both this and that, like squares, circles, and round triangles, or any changing or moving body. The assumption that contradictions are objectively present in nature is not sufficient, however, to apply the negation of the negation to natural phenomena. The assumption must also be made that these contradictions are, quote, an actual force, end quote, that makes things change, move, grow, develop, and create novelty. The Ionians, Plato and Aristotle, conceived nature as permeated by dynamic power. Nature was for them a world of spontaneously self-moving things. According to Wikipedia, the Ionian school of pre-Socratic philosophy refers to ancient Greek philosophers or a school of thought in Ionia in the 6th century BC, the first in the Western tradition. The Ionian school included such thinkers as Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Heraclitus, Anaxagoras, and Archelaus. This classification can be traced to the doxographer Sotion, the doxographer Diogenes Laertius. Divides pre-Socratic philosophy into the Ionian and Italian school. The collective affinity of the Ionians was first acknowledged by Aristotle, who called them physiologoi, or natural philosophers. The Ionians are sometimes referred to as cosmologists, since the Ionians studied stars and maths, gave cosmogonies, and were largely physicalists, who tried to explain the nature of matter. The first three philosophers, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, were all centered in the mercantile city of Miletus, on the Meander River, and are collectively referred to as the Milesian school. The Milesian school sought to explain nature by finding its fundamental element called the arche. The Milanesian school seemed to think, although matter could change from one form to another, all matter had something in common which did not change. They were thus characterized by Aristotle as material monists. They also believed all was alive, or were hylozoous. The Milesians did not agree on what all things had in common and did not seem to experiment to find out, but used abstract reasoning rather than religion or mythology to explain themselves. and are thus credited as the first philosophers. End footnote. Back to the text. So the Ionians, Plato, and Aristotle conceived nature as permeated by dynamic power. Nature was for the Ionians, Plato, and Aristotle a world of spontaneously self-moving things. Engels' view of nature was in certain respects like that of the Greeks, but unlike the Greek thinkers, Engels was a materialist. Engels was not free, therefore, to say with Thales that, quote, all things are full of gods, end quote. That natural bodies are the seat of the soul, which, as Empedocles taught, hates and loves. According to Wikipedia, Thales of Miletus, who lived from circa 1626 to circa 548 BC, was an ancient Greek pre-Socratic philosopher from Miletus in Ionia, Asia Minor. Thales was one of the 7 sages, founding figures of ancient Greece. Many regard Thales as the first philosopher in the Greek tradition, breaking from the prior use of mythology to explain the world and instead using natural philosophy. Thales is thus otherwise referred to as the first to have engaged in mathematics, science, and deductive reasoning. The first philosophers followed Thales in explaining all of nature as based on the existence of a single ultimate substance. Thales theorized that this single substance was water. Thales thought the earth floated on water. In mathematics, Thales is the namesake of Thales' theorem, and the intercept theorem can also be known as Thales' theorem. Thales was said to have calculated the heights of the pyramids and the distance of ships from the shore. In science, Thales was an astronomer who reportedly predicted the weather and a solar eclipse. The discovery of the position of the constellation Ursa Major is also attributed to Thales, as well as the timings of the solstices and equinoxes. Thales was also an engineer known for having diverted the Halys River. According to Wikipedia, Empedocles, who lived from circa 494 to 434 BC to 44 or 43 BC, 444 or 443 BC, was a Greek pre-Socratic philosopher and native citizen of Arragus, a Greek city in Sicily. Empedocles' philosophy is best known for originating the cosmogonic theory of the 4 classical elements. Empedocles also proposed forces Empedocles called love and strife, which would mix and separate the elements respectively. Empedocles challenged the practice of animal sacrifice and killing animals for food. Empedocles developed a distinctive doctrine of reincarnation. Empedocles is generally considered the last Greek philosopher to have recorded his ideas in verse. Some of Empedocles' work survives, more than is the case for any other pre-Socratic philosopher. Empedocles' death was mythologized by ancient writers and has been the subject of a number of literary treatments. So, back to the text. Engels was not free, therefore, to say with Thales that, quote, all things are full of gods, end quote, that natural bodies are the seats of the soul, and which, as Empedocles taught, hates and loves. Thus, Engels' theory of nature was bound to become anthropomorphic. For to describe natural processes in terms of dialectical negation or the negating force is to endow material objects with consciousness and purposefulness which only human beings display. Footnote. See H.B. Acton, The Illusion of the Epoch, and Sidney Hook, Reason, Social Myths, and Democracy. End footnote. Contradiction becomes a mysterious entity that is enclosed in material objects and which animates material objects. This entity is able to negate the opposites within itself, to reconcile or raise the opposites to a higher unity in which the contradiction is sublated, that is, overcome and preserved. Thus, it is able to impel change, motion, and development. This is worse than using a metaphorical language. This is verbal jugglery, as Eugen During justifiably argued. The anthropomorphic implications of the law of the triad are not invalidated by the distinction, taken over from Hegel, between subjective or immanent dialectics and objective or external dialectics. Subjective or immanent dialectics being the reflection of dialectics prevailing throughout nature. Engels argued that dialectics can be regarded as, quote, two sets of laws which are identical in substance but differ in those two sets of laws' expression, end quote, which, quote, we can separate from each other at most only in thought, but not in reality, end quote. Engels. First, the laws may be considered as methodological principles which the human mind applies in the investigation of physical, social, and mental phenomena. Second, the laws are statements about reality reflecting regularities in nature and history. For instance, there is the, quote, dialectically subjective, end quote, requirement that things should be considered in things, quote, essential connection, end quote, of mutual causal interdependence. At the same time, this methodological requirement holds as a, quote, dialectically objective, end quote, that is, metaphysical principle, stating that the whole of nature forms an interconnected totality of bodies. Dialectics may thus appear as a dual power, whose branches, the methodological rules and the statements about physical reality, support and verify each other. This fallacy rests upon the Hegelian assumption that to be is the same as to be known. If we assume the identity of reason and being, we can infer from the dialectical development of thought that reality develops dialectically too. Those, however, who reject this Hegelian assumption cannot make such an inference. In particular, one of the cardinal points in the Marxist-Leninist theory of knowledge is that knowledge involves the prior existence of a world which is to be known, and that if there were no world existing independently, there could be no knowledge of that world. Therefore, what dialectical materialists state as methodologists and metaphysicians is a tautology. Dialectical materialists say twice what needs saying only once. Section 4. The Doctrine of the Relativity of Knowledge. The assumption concerning the dialectical constitution of the world directly establishes the relativity of knowledge. John Stuart Mill used the phrase, the, quote, doctrine of the relativity of knowledge, end quote, as a family name for various kinds of phenomenalism, that is, the belief that our knowledge about external objects consists of nothing but the sensations which external objects excite, and therefore that objects are to us that which affects our senses in a certain manner. Footnote. John Stuart Mill, An Examination of Sir William Hamilton's Philosophy. End footnote. This is the view to which Mach and his supporters, as well as Avenarius and his school, subscribed, and which Mach and his supporters, as well as Avenarius and his school, subscribed, and which Lenin so vehemently opposed in Materialism and Empirio-criticism. Footnote. Lenin refers to it as, quote, relativism, i.e. the principle of the relativity of our knowledge, end quote. Although in Lenin this is the main meaning of the phrase, the, quote, doctrine of the relativity of knowledge, end quote, it is also used by Lenin in the sense considered below, in which it stands for the proposition that all scientific knowledge is provisional and relative. According to Wikipedia, Richard Avenarius lived from 1843 to 1896 and was a German-Swiss philosopher. Richard Avenarius formulated the radical positivist doctrine of empirical criticism or empirio-criticism. And also, according to Wikipedia, Ernst Mach, who lived from 1838 to 1916, was an Austrian physicist and philosopher who contributed to the physics of shock waves. The ratio of the speed of flow or object to that of sound is named the Mach number in his honor. As a philosopher of science, he was a major influence on logical positivism and American pragmatism. Through Ernst Mach's criticism of Isaac Newton's theories of space and time, Ernst Mach foreshadowed Albert Einstein's theory of relativity. Anyway, back to the text. Oh yeah, I wanted to look up empirio-criticism. According to Ernst Mach's Wikipedia, the section titled Empirio-criticism, from 1895 to 1901, Mach held a newly created chair for the quote, history and philosophy of the inductive sciences, end quote, at the University of Vienna. In Mach's historico-philosophical studies, Mach developed a phenomenalistic philosophy of science that became influential in the 19th and 20th centuries. Ernst Mach originally saw scientific laws as summaries of experimental events constructed for the purpose of making complex data comprehensible, but later emphasized mathematical functions as a more useful way to describe sensory appearances. Thus, scientific laws, while somewhat idealized, have more to do with describing sensations than with reality, as reality exists beyond sensations. I'm not sure. This looks like it's a quote, but I'm not sure. So I'm going to say it's a quote, but it might not be. Quote, the goal which it, parenthesis, physical science, end parenthesis, has set physical science's self is the simplest and most economical abstract expression of facts. When the human mind, with the human mind's limited powers, attempts to mirror in itself the rich life of the world, of which the human mind itself is only a small part, and which the human mind can never hope to exhaust, the human mind has every reason for proceeding economically. In reality, the law always contains less than the fact itself, because the law does not reproduce the fact as a whole, but only in that aspect of the fact which is important for us, the rest being intentionally or from necessity omitted. In mentally separating a body from the changeable environment in which it moves, what we really do is extricate a group of sensations on which our thoughts are fastened and which is of relatively greater stability than the others, from the stream of all our sensations. Suppose we were to attribute to nature the property of producing like effects in like circumstances. Just these like circumstances we should not know how to find. Nature exists only once. Our schematic mental imitation alone produces like events." End quote. Mach's positivism influenced many Russian Marxists such as Alexander Bogdanov. In 1908, Lenin wrote a philosophical work, Materialism and Imperial Criticism, in which he criticized Marxism and the views of, quote, Russian Marxists, end quote. Lenin's main criticisms were that Marx's philosophy led to solipsism and to the absurd conclusion that nature did not exist before humans. Quote, "If bodies are, quote, complexes and sensations," end quote, as Marx says, or, quote, "combinations of sensations," end quote, as Berkeley said, it inevitably follows that the whole world is but my idea. Starting from such a premise, it is impossible to arrive at the existence of other people besides oneself. It is the purest solipsism. ... If, Mach, end bracket, does not admit that the, quote, sensible content, end quote, is an objective reality existing independently of us, there remains only a, quote, naked abstract, end quote, I, and I, infallibly written with a capital letter and italicized, equal to the, quote, insane piano, which imagined that it was the sole existing thing in this world, end quote. If the, quote, sensible content, end quote, of our sensation is not the external world, then nothing exists save this naked I engaged in empty, quote, philosophical, end quote, acrobatics, end quote. Lenin, chapter 1.1, quote, sensation, titled Sensations and Complexes of Sensations. Imperial criticism is the term for the rigorously positivist and radically empiricist philosophy established by the German philosopher Richard Avenarius and further developed by Mach, Joseph Petzold, and others, that claims that all we can know is our sensations and that knowledge should be confined to pure experience. In accordance with imperial critical philosophy, Mach opposed Boltzmann and others who proposed an atomic theory of physics, since one cannot observe things as small as atoms directly, and since no atomic model at the time was consistent, the atomic hypothesis seemed unwarranted to Mach, and perhaps not sufficiently, quote, economical. Mach had a direct influence on the Vienna Circle philosophers and logical positivism in general. Several principles are attributed to Mach that distill his ideal of physical theorization called, quote, Machian physics. 1. It should be based entirely on direct, observable phenomena in line with its positivistic leanings. 2. It should completely eschew absolute space and time in favor of relative motion. 3. Any phenomena that seem attributable to absolute space and time, e.g. inertia and centrifugal force, should instead be seen as emerging from the distribution of matter in the universe. The last is singled out, particularly by Einstein, as the, quote, Mach's principle. Einstein cited it as one of the three principles underlying general relativity. In 1930, Einstein wrote, quote, "It is justified to consider Mach as the precursor of the general theory of relativity," end quote. Though Mach, before his death, apparently rejected Einstein's theory, Einstein knew that his theories did not fulfill all Mach's principles, and neither has any subsequent theory, despite considerable effort. Okay, so that was kind of a long detour, but hopefully we got something out of it. Back to the text. Engels' doctrine of the relativity of knowledge had nothing to do with the phenomenalism of Mill, Mach, or Avenarius. The relativity of knowledge in Engels' sense stands for the proposition that scientific knowledge is provisional, cumulative, evolutionary, and thus never exhaustive and final. Engels seems to have followed in the footsteps of Comte, whose epistemological and sociological considerations for the relativity of knowledge Engels fully endorsed. But in Engels' mind, these considerations were associated with Engels' dialectical outlook on nature. In Engels' dialectical outlook on nature, it is Engels' dialectical outlook on nature that provided the background against which Engels evaluated the metaphysician's vain dream of attaining absolute certainty and immutable truth. If all the processes of nature are, quote, systematically connected, end quote, an adequate description of this interconnection and the formation of a, quote, exact mental image of the world system, end quote, is not possible for us. Quote, because of the nature both of men and of the world system, this task can never be completely fulfilled, ... Each mental image of the world system is and remains in actual fact limited, objectively by the historical conditions and subjectively by the physical and mental constitution of its originators, end quote. Engels, Anti-During. The subjective limitations from which the relativity of knowledge results are determined by the fact that no single generation can attain perfect and complete knowledge. Only an endless succession of generations can approximate this objective. At every stage of knowledge, there is always more that can be improved upon than not. It includes a number of, quote, relative errors, end quote, gaps due to inadequate information, the absence of relevant evidence, or the transitory nature of the subject matter. Moreover, all knowledge is socially determined, and in this sense is relative and never absolute, approximate and never ultimate. Consequently, the knowledge attained by every generation is never final or complete. Footnote. Engels, Anti-During. And footnote. Engels felt that the doctrine of the relativity of knowledge grew out of the Hegelian dialectical philosophy, of Hegelian dialectical philosophy's insistence on the transitory character of everything, and Hegelian dialectical philosophy's refusal to consider anything as final and absolute. Engels implied that the influence of Hegel's philosophical speculations in the acceptance of an evolutionary approach to knowledge was due to the fact that in Hegel's time a scientifically formulated concept of evolution could not be put forward at all. Kant's cosmological theory continued to be regarded as a mere curiosity. The evolutionary ideas in geology had not yet appeared, and the, quote, evolution of species, end quote, was a hypothesis still unheard of. It should be emphasized, however, that the idea of development was in the intellectual atmosphere, and Hegel's philosophy was only one of the trends in the advance towards an evolutionary world outlook, which finally destroyed the view of the immutability of nature. See R.G. Collingwood, The Idea of Nature, page 10, end footnote. The doctrine of the relativity of knowledge must be considered against a wider historical background, an impressive description of which is to be found in the introductory chapter of Dialectics of Nature and in the so-called Old Preface to Anti-During. According to Engels, 3 periods and 3 conceptions of nature can be differentiated in the history of European thought: the cosmology of Greek antiquity, modern cosmology, and the evolutionary cosmological conception of today. Footnote. In The Idea of Nature, R.G. Collingwood differentiated the same 3 periods of cosmological thinking as Engels did. There is a striking agreement in the description of each period between the 2 writers. End footnote. Modern research into nature began with the Renaissance, and without its systematic all-round development, the new evolutionary outlook would not have come about. But theoretically, the middle stage in the history of cosmology was a period of regression. And the evolutionary cosmology of today is a return to the outlook initiated by the founders of Greek philosophy, rather than a continuation of a more recent past. The cosmological conception formulated by the founders of Greek philosophy was based on the premise that the whole of nature, from grains of sand to suns, from protista to man, quote, has its essence in eternal coming into being and passing away, in ceaseless flux, in unrest and motion and change, end quote. For the Greeks, the world was something that had emerged from chaos and had developed. The Greeks viewed nature as a whole and were aware of the universal connection of natural phenomena. Although the Greek conception of nature was the result of intuitive understanding and direct contemplation, and its knowledge of natural science was inferior to that of modern cosmology, Greek antiquity stood above modern cosmology in Greek antiquity's general outlook on nature. The central point of the modern cosmological concept was the belief in the immutability of nature. All development and real change were denied. The planets and the stars, the Earth's surface, and the species of plants and animals had remained the same since they had come into existence and would remain unchanged to the end of the world. Natural scientists of that period regarded the order of nature as fixed and, quote, created at one stroke, end quote. The first breach in this outlook was accomplished by classical German philosophy from Kant to Hegel. When Kant formulated his nebular hypothesis, later endorsed and developed by Laplace, the solar system appeared as something that had come into being, and thus for the first time in the modern period of a natural object was shown to possess a, quote, history in time. Wikipedia says, the nebular hypothesis is the most widely accepted model in the field of cosmogony to explain the formation and evolution of the solar system as well as other planetary systems. The nebular hypothesis suggests the solar system is formed from gas and dust orbiting the sun, which clumped up together to form the planets. The nebular hypothesis was developed by Immanuel Kant and published in his Universal Natural History and the Theory of the Heavens, published in 1755 and then modified in 1796 by Pierre Laplace. Originally applied to the solar system, the process of planetary system formation is now thought to be at work throughout the universe. The widely accepted modern variant of the nebular theory is the Solar Nebular Disk Model, SNDM, or Solar Nebular Model. It offered explanations for a variety of properties of the solar system, including the nearly circular and co-planar orbits of the planets and their motion in the same direction as the sun's rotation. Some elements of the original nebular theory are echoed in modern theories of planetary formation, but most elements have been superseded. According to the nebular theory, stars form in massive and dense clouds of molecular hydrogen, giant molecular clouds, GMC. These clouds are gravitationally unstable and matter coalesces within them to smaller, denser clumps which then rotate, collapse, and form stars. Star formation is a complex process which always produces a gaseous protoplanetary disk, propeled around the younger star. This may give birth to planets in certain circumstances which are not well known. Thus, the formation of planetary systems is thought to be a natural result of star formation. A sun-like star usually takes approximately 1 million years to form, with the protoplanetary disk evolving into a planetary system over the next 10 to 100 million years. The protoplanetary disk is an accretion disk that feeds the central star. Initially very hot, the disk later cools in what is known as the T Tauri star stage. Here, formation of small dust grains made of rocks and ice is possible. The grains eventually may coagulate into kilometer-sized planetesimals. If the disk is massive enough, the runaway accretions begin, resulting in the rapid 100,000 to 300,000 years formation of Moon to Mars-sized planetary embryos. Near the star, the planetary embryos go through a stage of violent mergers, producing a few terrestrial planets. The last stage takes approximately 100 million to a billion years. The formation of giant planets is a more complicated process. It is thought to occur beyond the frost line, where planetary embryos mainly are made of various types of ice. As a result, they are several times more massive than in the inner part of the protoplanetary disk. What follows after the embryo formation is not completely clear. Some embryos appear to continue to grow and eventually reach 5 to 10 Earth masses, the threshold value which is necessary to begin accretion of the hydrogen-helium gas from the disk. The accumulation of gas by the core is initially a slow process, which continues for several million years, but after the forming protoplanet reaches about 30 Earth masses, it accelerates and proceeds in a runaway manner. Jupiter and Saturn-like planets are thought to accumulate the bulk of their mass during only 10,000 years. The accretion stops when the gas is exhausted. The formed planets can migrate over long distances during or after their formation. Ice giants such as Uranus and Neptune are thought to be failed cores, which formed too late when the disk had almost disappeared. Well, that's the end of that. I learned nothing there, but that's my fault. When Kant formulated his nebular hypothesis, later endorsed and developed by Laplace, the solar system appeared as something that had come into being. Thus, for the first time in the modern period, a natural object was shown to possess a, quote, history in time, end quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. The new ideas which Kant introduced in his Allgemeine Naturgeschichte und Theorie des Himmels, published in 1775, were finally victorious with the publication of The Origin of Species in 1859. This was the beginning of the new evolutionary or historical outlook on nature. This book by Kant refers to this Allgemeine Naturgeschichte und Theorie des Himmels translates as Universal History and Theory of the Heavens, subtitled, or an attempt to account for the constitutional and mechanical origin of the universe upon Newtonian principles, is a work written and published anonymously by Immanuel Kant in 1755. According to Kant, the solar system is merely a smaller version of the fixed star systems, such as the Milky Way and other galaxies. The cosmogony that Kant proposes is closer to today's accepted ideas than that of some of his contemporary thinkers, such as Pierre-Simon Laplace. Moreover, Kant's thought in this volume is strongly influenced by the atomist theory, in addition to the ideas of Lucretius. End footnote. Or not end footnote, but back to the text. The new ideas which Kant introduced in his Allgemeine Naturgeschichte und Theorie des Himmels, published in 1775. It sounds like it was originally published in 1755. The dates on Wikipedia contradict what's in the book. I would go with the book, but the book's kind of old, so... We're finally victorious with the publication of The Origin of Species in 1859. This was the beginning of the new evolutionary or historical outlook on nature. The modern period witnesses an enormous advance in scientific knowledge, an advance that was achieved by the, quote, analysis of nature into its individual parts, the grouping of the different natural processes and objects in definite classes, end quote. This method established the metaphysical mode of thought. Natural objects were observed in isolation instead of in natural objects' interrelation, in repose and not in motion, as unchanging and not as essentially variable. Footnote. Engels, Anti-Düring. Elsewhere, Engels presented the metaphysical mode of thought peculiar to natural science as the inheritance from English empiricism. End footnote. Although Kant paved the way for the historical conception of nature, the cosmology of immutability continued to dominate the minds of scientists and philosophers for another century. I was looking to see if there's anything for the cosmology of immutability, but I can't find anything that seems promising. But this was the period of the growth of various seminal scientific ideas which finally destroyed the metaphysical conception of nature. Laplace and Herschel in astronomy, Lyell in geology, Meyer and Joule in physics, Lavoisier and Dalton in chemistry, Oken, Lamarck, Baer, and Darwin in biology all helped to establish an entirely new historical, dialectical, or evolutionary outlook on nature. Classical German philosophy, and above all the philosophy of Hegel, which also contributed to the dissolution of all rigidity and fixity and to the view of nature as moving in eternal flux, fall into this period. Thus, the historical and dialectical conception of nature has been based on the view that the world attained the world's present state not by an act of creation, but by a slow process extending over long periods, with the recognition that, quote, everything must have a history and time, end quote. That changeability is a pervading trait of reality, and that reality has a multi-level structure. The dialectical method becomes, quote, the most important form of thinking for present-day natural science, end quote. For it is the dialectical method alone that is able to explain, quote, the evolutionary processes occurring in nature, interconnections in general, and transitions from one field of investigations to another field of investigations, end quote. Engels, Dialectics of Nature. As has been pointed out earlier, Engels' distinction between the metaphysical and dialectical modes of thought is based on Hegel's distinction between the philosophy of understanding and that of speculative reason. Like Hegel's philosopher of understanding, Engels' metaphysician adheres to the laws of identity, the excluded middle, and non-contradiction, and consequently is unable to attain knowledge of nature as a whole. This can only be achieved by dialectical thought, which rejects the laws of formal logic, follows its own rules, and is thus capable of grasping change, motion, and development, in which contradictions are present in corporeal form. The Hegel's speculative distinction between understanding and speculative reason acquire, in Engels' conception, additional characteristics drawn from the contrast between modern cosmology and evolutionary cosmology. The assumption of the immutability of nature gives rise to the metaphysical mode of thought. Once this mode of thought was established, it reinforced and perpetuated the view that, quote, nature had no history, end quote. On the other hand, the Kantian hypothesis concerning the origin of the solar system, which turns out to be the point of departure for further advance towards the historical conception of nature, was an instance of dialectical thought. The evolutionary conception of nature and the dialectical mode of thought are as closely associated with each other as are modern cosmology and the metaphysical mode of thought. The main difference between the two conceptions of nature is that the latter considers every constituent of the world as fixed and unchanging, whereas the former shows everything as moving in, quote, eternal flux, end quote. To emphasize this difference between the two outlooks on nature is not such an obvious commonplace as some critics maintain. Modern cosmology did not deny change as long as the transformations from state A to state B was so related to its predecessor and successor that whatever changed from state A to state B always ultimately returned from this state B to that state A. Quote, "It is true," end quote, Engels wrote, quote, "that nature was obviously in constant motion, but this motion appeared as an incessant repetition of the same process," end quote. Engels, anti-during. Let me repeat that. I think I might have said it wrong. Quote, "It is true," end quote, Engels wrote, quote, "that nature was obviously in constant motion, but this constant motion appeared as an incessant repetition of the same processes," end quote. Engels, anti-during. In other words, according to modern cosmology, there was change, but change was cyclical, and there was motion, but motion did not involve advance and development. Footnote. Modern cosmology should be more or less identified with the Cartesian, Newtonian, mechanistic conception of the world, in which time is independent variable and can be given any value in the two directions of the time continuum, between which there seems to be no intrinsic difference. In other words, time being reversible is not an important factor in the Cartesian Newtonian outlook. What is important is the regular behavior of elements whose combination impervious to time obey invariant patterns or laws. The assumption of the mechanistic conception of the world that the, quote, "lapse of time," end quote, as Whitehead put it, quote, "is an accident," end quote, gives rise to the doctrine that the universe is a running mechanism, endlessly repeating the succession of its developmental stages in an eternal cycle. This doctrine, widely accepted in 19th century cosmology, is discussed by Engels in Dialectics of Nature. End footnote. The flow of time had no significance, and time itself was a mere coordinate. The concept of reversible natural processes contained no absurdity and implied the denial of real novelties in the universe. On the other hand, the evolutionary outlook emphasized the irreversibility of time and the creative advance of nature, which Whitehead was to describe as the, quote, "perpetual transition of nature into novelty," end quote. Whitehead, The Concept of Nature. The evolutionary outlook end footnote. The evolutionary outlook replaced the Democritean concept of motion by the Aristotelian concept of change, alteration, or transformation, and conceived the motion of a body as no mere displacement, but as a manifestation of some inherent change within the moving body itself. Therefore, a change was no longer repeatable and cyclical, but involved in evolutionary development and the emergence of novelty. The two outlooks are clearly differentiated by their conceptions of time and their attitudes to history. According to modern cosmology, nature has known no passage of time and has had no history. In the evolutionary view, it has had a development in time and a history. To put it differently, whereas modern man followed in the footsteps of modern man's ancestors of archaic societies and depreciated concrete historical time, the man of today who lives within history and recognizes history's autonomy was born only in the very recent period, which Engels identified with the post-Hegelian era. Footnote. The question as to why man should be anxious to disregard history is a fascinating sociological problem to which the myth of the eternal return by Mircea Eliade has made a noteworthy contribution. End footnote. Engels' differentiation between the two conceptions of nature in modern times both amplified and restricted the distinction of the metaphysical and dialectical modes of thought. This is understood neither by his opponents nor by his supporters, Marxist-Leninists in particular. Engels did not hold the metaphysical mode of thought responsible for the denial of change, which is repeatable and cyclical, but for the denial of change that is a process of growth, development, and advance. The point at issue between metaphysics and dialectics is not whether Parmenides or Heraclitus is right, but whether nature moves eternally in a recurring circle or goes through a, quote, real historical evolution, end quote. That is the end of Chapter 5 of The Evolution of Dialectical Materialism, a Philosophical and Sociological Analysis by Z.A. Jordan. I hope you got something out of listening to this, and I hope you don't mind me looking things up that I don't know. Alright, thanks for listening.